Hello, and welcome back to another evening of stories and shared company. Tonight, we're going deep into one of the wildest, most controversial, and honestly, one of the most important shows in television history. We're talking about South Park. Specifically, we're talking about the episodes that almost killed it. The moments where the show went so far, crossed so many lines, and made so many enemies that it genuinely looked like it was over. Death threats, government intervention, international bans, billion-dollar corporations panicking behind closed doors. All of that happened multiple times, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, the show survived all of it, and is still running nearly 3 decades later. So tonight, I'll be covering as much as I possibly can. We'll start from the very beginning, how 2 college kids from Colorado created one of the first viral videos on the internet and turned it into a cultural phenomenon. Then we'll work our way through the controversies, the Scientology war, the Catholic Church boycott, the episodes that are still banned to this day because of actual terrorist threats, celebrity feuds, racial controversies, entire countries banning the show from their internet. There's so much to talk about, and I'll do my best to get through all of it tonight, but there's definitely enough material for future videos too. If you enjoy what I do here and want to support the channel, consider subscribing down below. But for now, grab a blanket, get comfortable, settle in for a long one, and let's begin. So to really understand how South Park became the lightning rod it is today, you have to go all the way back to the early 1990s. Before the show existed, before Comedy Central was even a real player in cable television, before any of this was a thing, there were just 2 guys, Trey Parker and Matt Stone. They met at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where Parker was studying film and Japanese, and Stone was studying math and art. And the way they tell it, they bonded almost immediately over a shared love of Monty Python and this very specific kind of humor that was provocative and anti-authoritarian and just deeply weird. While they were still students, they started making short films together, like constantly. Parker later said they were shooting something nearly every week. Their first real project was a feature-length musical called Cannibal, the musical which they made while still in college. It was about Alfred Packer, a real historical figure who was convicted of cannibalism in the 1880s. And yes, they made a musical about it. That should tell you everything about where their heads were at, even back then. But the thing that actually started the South Park train rolling was a short, animated film they made in 1992 called The Spirit of Christmas. It was this crude, rough little thing made with actual cutout construction paper, and it featured early prototypes of the 4 kids who would eventually become Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. The plot, if you can call it that, was Jesus fighting Frosty the Snowman. It was bizarre and offensive and kind of brilliant in this very raw, unpolished way. That short caught the attention of a television executive named Brian Graydon. He liked what he saw enough to send Parker and Stone a check for $1,200, basically asking them to make another version he could send out as a Christmas video card to his friends. So in 1995, they made a second Spirit of Christmas short, this time with Jesus fighting Santa Claus. It was bloodier, funnier, and way more polished than the first one. And here's where things get interesting. Graydon sent it to a production house where it was copied onto nearly 100 VHS tapes. Those tapes got copied again and again. People started sharing them, passing them around Hollywood, showing them at parties. Some people even tried to claim they'd made it themselves. This was 1995, remember? There was no YouTube. There was no social media. The internet was still in its infancy. But college campuses were starting to get these new high-speed T1 internet lines. And somehow digital copies of the short started spreading online. It became one of the very first viral videos before anyone had even coined that term. Parker and Stone didn't fully grasp what was happening at first. They'd be at parties and people would ask them if they'd seen this crazy animated Christmas video, not realizing they were talking to the guys who made it. The buzz got loud enough that executives started paying attention. They met with several networks and the reception was mostly the same. People loved the creativity but questioned whether it could actually work as a television show. You've got to remember, this was a time when the only real animated show aimed at adults was The Simpsons. The idea of something this crude, this offensive, this deliberately provocative being on television every week was genuinely new territory. Fox considered it, but ultimately passed. Parker actually preferred that it not go to MTV because he was worried they'd turn it into a kids' show. Eventually, Comedy Central made an offer. At the time, the network was tiny. They had just lost the rights to Mystery Science Theater 3000 to the Sci-Fi Channel, and the only animated show they had was Dr. Katz, Professional Therapist. They were hungry for something that would put them on the map. Doug Herzog was the Comedy Central executive who greenlit the series, and he later said there was nothing like it on television at the time. No context for it at all. The network gave Parker and Stone the go-ahead to develop a pilot, which they titled Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. And yes, that was the very first episode of South Park. The title alone should give you a sense of what Comedy Central was signing up for. The pilot was made on a budget of about $300,000 and took between 3 and 3.5 months to complete. Parker and Stone animated it in a small room at Celluloid Studios in Denver, Colorado during the summer of 1996. Just like the Christmas shorts, the original pilot was animated entirely with traditional cut paper stop-motion techniques. Parker and Stone sometimes slept at the studio because they were working such long hours. It was just the two of them and a tiny crew hunched over construction paper in the dark, cutting out little shapes and moving them frame by frame. The idea for the town of South Park itself came from a real place. There's an actual basin in Colorado called South Park, and according to Parker and Stone, it was known for UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, and Bigfoot reports. That folklore gave the fictional town its slightly unhinged vibe, where aliens and supernatural events are just part of everyday life alongside the mundane reality of being a kid in a small mountain town. Here's a detail I find really funny. Before the show even aired, Comedy Central was already making money off it. They marketed it aggressively, billing it as why they created the V-chip. And the resulting buzz led to an estimated $30 million in t-shirt sales alone before a single episode had been broadcast. $30 million in t-shirts before the show even existed as a real show. That's kind of insane when you think about it, but there was a real moment of doubt. The pilot tested horribly with certain demographics, particularly women. South Park was genuinely in danger of being canceled before it ever aired. However, the shorts were still gaining more and more popularity over the internet. And that grassroots momentum convinced Comedy Central to order an initial run of 6 episodes and just see what happened. South Park premiered on August 13th, 1997, and what happened was basically an explosion. The first episode pulled in 889,000 viewers, which might not sound massive by today's standards, but for a tiny cable network at the time, it was enormous, and it just kept growing from there. By the end of the first season, episodes were pulling in 5.5 million viewers. Comedy Central went from being available in 9.1 million households to 50 million by June of 1998. The show didn't just succeed. It fundamentally changed the network that aired it. The financial numbers are honestly kind of staggering. When South Park first debuted, the most Comedy Central had ever earned for a 30-second commercial was $7,500. Within a single year, advertisers were paying an average of $40,000 for 30 seconds during South Park, and some were paying as much as $80,000. By the end of 1998, Comedy Central had sold more than $150 million worth of merchandise for the show. T-shirts, dolls, hats, you name it. South Park wasn't just a TV show, it was an industry. But the backlash started almost immediately, and I mean immediately. Within weeks of the show airing, schools across the United States began punishing students for wearing South Park merchandise. A group of school principals in New Jersey mounted a small campaign to notify parents about the show's content. Hickory Flat Elementary School in Cherokee County, Georgia, issued a flat-out ban on wearing any South Park clothing whatsoever. In the United Kingdom, things got even more interesting. In 1999, a poll conducted by NatWest Bank asked 8- and 9-year-old children to name their favorite personality, and the winner was Eric Cartman. A fictional, foul-mouthed, racist, manipulative cartoon child was the most popular figure among actual children in Britain. This drew enormous concern from parent councils, who had been expecting the winner to be someone from a children's television show. The headmaster of a public school in Cambridgeshire actually urged parents to stop their children from watching the show entirely. Parker and Stone's response to all of this was pretty much what you'd expect. They acknowledged that the show was absolutely not meant for children. It's almost always rated TVMA and comes with a content warning at the top of every episode. But they also weren't about to change anything. Their philosophy from day one was simple, and they've stuck to it for almost 30 years. They consider themselves equal opportunity offenders. They reject the idea of political correctness, and they've stated publicly that no particular topic or group of people will be exempt from being mocked, because they feel that exempting anyone would be unfair to everyone who's already been made fun of. And that philosophy, that absolute refusal to draw a line and say, okay, we won't go there, is exactly what would get them into genuinely serious trouble, over and over and over again. The school bans and the parent complaints were just the very beginning. Those were the kinds of controversies you'd expect from a crude animated show about kids who swear too much. The real heat, the kind of heat that involved international incidents and death threats and actual criminal investigations that came later. But before we get to all of that, I want to talk a little about how those early years shaped the show's identity, because I think it matters for understanding everything that comes after. See, Parker and Stone weren't just being offensive for the sake of it. Well, sometimes they were. But underneath the crude humor and the shock value, they were building something that was genuinely new on television. They were creating a show that used animation and absurdity to comment on real things happening in the real world, often within days of those things happening. Their production process eventually evolved into something truly unique. Unlike other animated shows like The Simpsons or Family Guy, which take months to produce a single episode, South Park episodes are written, animated, and aired within a single week. They subjectively chose this approach because they found that working under an extreme deadline forced them to be more spontaneous and creative. It also meant they could react to current events in almost real time. If something major happened on a Monday, there could be a South Park episode about it by Wednesday. No other animated show on television could do that, and honestly, very few live-action shows could match that speed either. This weekly turnaround became one of their greatest advantages. It meant South Park was always relevant, always part of the conversation, always making people talk, and it meant that when something controversial happened, the response was immediate. There was no 6-month delay between writing and airing. The outrage was fresh, the comedy was sharp, and the cultural impact was instant. The other thing about those early years is that Parker and Stone built up an enormous amount of leverage with Comedy Central very quickly. The network needed them far more than they needed the network. South Park was single-handedly responsible for Comedy Central's growth from a niche cable channel to a major player in the television landscape. That leverage gave Parker and Stone a level of creative freedom that almost no other show creators in television history have enjoyed. Comedy Central could push back, could ask them to tone things down, could occasionally refuse to air something, but they couldn't fire them. They couldn't cancel the show, because without South Park, Comedy Central would go right back to being the tiny network nobody watched. And Parker and Stone knew this. They absolutely knew this. And they used that leverage again and again to push the boundaries further than anyone thought possible. The network had essentially created a monster it couldn't control. And that monster was about to start picking fights with some of the biggest and most powerful organizations on the planet. But the first truly big fight, the one that changed everything and set the stage for all the insanity that would follow, actually had nothing to do with the show itself. It was the movie. In 1999, Parker and Stone released South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. And I want to be clear about this. They went into that movie knowing it might be the end of the South Park phenomenon. They'd seen the ratings starting to dip in season 3. The premiere of that season drew 3.4 million viewers, which was a massive drop from the 5.5 million of the previous season. Parker and Stone figured the hype was fading, so they decided to put everything they had into the movie. If the whole thing was going to end, they wanted to go out with something they were proud of. The movie contained 399 profanities. It was packed with musical numbers that were simultaneously hilarious and genuinely well-written. The MPAA, which is the organization that rates films in the United States, kept giving it an NC-17 rating, which would have essentially killed it commercially. Parker and Stone fought back by deliberately submitting increasingly extreme versions of the film, so that when they showed the version they actually wanted to release, it seemed tame by comparison. It was a brilliantly manipulative strategy, and it worked. The movie got an R rating. At the Academy Awards that year, Robin Williams performed the nominated song Blame Canada from the film. Parker and Stone showed up to the Oscars wearing dresses, which they later said they'd done because they were on acid at the time. Whether that's true or just a great story, it perfectly captured the energy of two guys who genuinely did not care about playing by Hollywood's rules. The movie was both a critical and commercial success, and it proved something important. South Park wasn't just a flash in the pan. It wasn't just a novelty that would burn bright and fade away. It was something that could evolve, that could sustain itself, that could push into new territory and find new audiences. And that realization, both for Parker and Stone and for Comedy Central, set the stage for everything that would come next. Because once they knew the show could survive, once they knew they had the leverage and the audience and the creative freedom to do basically whatever they wanted, they stopped holding back entirely. And the targets got bigger. Much bigger. The school principals and parent councils of the late 90s had been upset about swearing and crude humor. What was coming next would involve some of the wealthiest, most litigious, and most dangerous organizations on the face of the earth. And it all started with a 10-year-old boy taking a free personality test. Now, the early seasons of South Park are kind of fascinating to look back on, because the stuff that got people upset back then seems almost quaint compared to what came later. But at the time, these were genuine controversies. These were moments where Comedy Central executives were losing sleep, where advertisers were threatening to pull out, and where Parker and Stone were learning exactly how far they could push before the network pushed back. One of the first real censorship battles came with the 5th episode of the very first season, An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig. I mean, just that title alone tells you what kind of show this was. The episode featured a subplot where Stan's sister Shelley was being physically abusive toward him, and there was originally a scene where she repeatedly lit him on fire and then put the fire out with a bucket of water. Comedy Central cut that scene, and the reason they cut it had nothing to do with South Park specifically. It was because of Beavis and Butthead. A few years earlier, an episode of that show had been blamed for inspiring a 5-year-old child to start a fire that killed his infant sister. After that tragedy, networks became extremely cautious about depicting fire-related violence in animation. So the scene was cut, and Parker and Stone went along with it. But it established a pattern that would repeat for the next 3 decades. South Park writes something insane, the network gets nervous, something gets trimmed or pulled, and everyone moves on to the next battle. Season 1 also featured an episode called Death that touched on assisted suicide, with Stan's grandfather desperately wanting to die and asking the boys to help him end his life. At the same time, the episode had this brilliantly meta subplot where the parents of South Park were protesting the Terrence and Phillip show for being crude and inappropriate for children, which was obviously a direct commentary on the protests against South Park itself. It was one of the first times Parker and Stone turned the camera back on their own critics and said, "Yeah, we see you and we think you're being ridiculous." That willingness to directly acknowledge and mock the people trying to shut them down became one of their most effective weapons over the years. But honestly, one of the funniest early controversies had nothing to do with content at all. It was a troll. At the end of season 1, the show aired an episode called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, which set up this big mystery about who Cartman's real father was. It was a genuine cliffhanger, one of the first in the show's history, and fans were desperate for the answer. Then season 2 premiered, and instead of resolving the cliffhanger, the episode was an entirely unrelated Terrence and Phillip special. It had absolutely nothing to do with Cartman's parentage. Parker and Stone had basically looked at their audience, seen how invested they were, and decided to mess with them for the pure fun of it. The fan reaction was enormous. People were furious. Letters poured into Comedy Central. Viewers felt cheated and angry and completely taken for a ride. The actual resolution came later that month, and the whole thing blew over eventually, but it showed something important about Parker and Stone's relationship with their audience. They weren't afraid to antagonize the very people who were making them rich. They weren't trying to please everyone all the time. They were making the show they wanted to make, and if that meant occasionally infuriating their own fans for a laugh, so be it. Through all of this, Parker and Stone's leverage with Comedy Central kept growing. By the end of the first season, the show had completely transformed the network's financial picture. They signed a deal in April of 1998 that contracted them to keep producing South Park through 1999, gave them a share of the merchandising revenue, which was absolutely massive at that point, and included a 7-figure cash bonus to bring the show to the big screen. Comedy Central was making so much money from South Park that they essentially had to give Parker and Stone whatever they wanted. And what Parker and Stone wanted was freedom. Freedom to push further, to be more offensive, to go after bigger targets, and to never have anyone tell them they couldn't. That freedom showed up in the kinds of jokes they were willing to make. Season 2 featured an episode where the word shit was used 162 times. They did episodes mocking everything from Mormonism to mental disability to sexual abuse. And they did it all with this very specific brand of equal opportunity vulgarity that made it hard for any single group to claim they were being singled out. If you came after South Park for mocking your religion, they could point to the 5 other religions they'd already mocked that season. If you said they were being racist, they could show you episodes where they'd been equally offensive to every racial group imaginable. Their defense was always the same. We make fun of everyone, no exceptions. During these early seasons, a bunch of high-profile celebrities actually wanted to be on the show, which is kind of amazing when you think about how many celebrities the show regularly destroyed. Parker and Stone had this running joke where they'd respond to celebrity requests by offering them the most humiliating low-profile roles possible. George Clooney provided the barks for Stan's dog in one episode. Jay Leno did the meows for Cartman's cat. Henry Winkler, the Fonz himself, voiced the growls and grunts of a kid-eating monster. These were A-list celebrities, and they were happy to make animal noises for 5 minutes of recording, because being associated with South Park was that culturally significant. But I want to come back to the movie for a moment because it really was a turning point. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, came out in June of 1999, and it represented the absolute peak of the show's cultural moment. The film was essentially a musical, a really good musical, actually. Parker, who had studied at Berklee College of Music before transferring to CU Boulder, wrote songs that were genuinely clever and catchy and filthy, and sometimes all 3 at once. The song Blame Canada was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song, which is just an objectively hilarious thing to happen to a movie where Satan and Saddam Hussein are in a romantic relationship. The battle with the MPAA over the film's rating became a controversy in its own right. The ratings board kept slapping it with an NC-17, which would have been a commercial death sentence. Parker and Stone went through something like 6 rounds of revisions, but they played the system brilliantly. Each time they resubmitted, they'd include material that was even more extreme than what the MPAA had originally objected to, so that when they compromised and removed the new stuff, the original content seemed acceptable by comparison. It was a chess match, and Parker and Stone won it decisively. The film was released with an R rating and went on to gross over $83 million worldwide. What I find really interesting about the movie is how it handled the theme of censorship, because that theme would become central to some of the show's biggest controversies in the years that followed. The entire plot of the film is about parents blaming Canada for corrupting their children through the Terrence and Phillip movie, leading to an actual war between the United States and Canada. It's a satire of moral panic, of the instinct to blame entertainment for societal problems, and of the hypocrisy of adults who commit acts of violence in the name of protecting children from fictional violence. In retrospect, the movie feels almost prophetic, because everything it satirized, the moral outrage, the censorship, the powerful institutions trying to shut down speech they didn't like, all of that would come back in real life in ways that were far more serious and far more dangerous than anything a cartoon movie could imagine. After the movie, things got quieter for a little while. Season 3 saw a dip in ratings, which Parker and Stone actually welcomed. They said the initial ratings had been inflated by media hype, and the dip represented the show's true audience, the people who actually loved it and weren't just watching because it was trendy. In some ways, that was a healthier place for the show to be. The hype machine had moved on, the novelty had worn off, And what was left was a show with a dedicated audience and creators who were more committed than ever to pushing boundaries. And push they did. Seasons 4 through 8 saw the show evolve from a shock comedy about foul-mouthed kids into something much sharper and more politically engaged. The weekly production schedule meant they could react to real events almost instantly. When something happened in the news, South Park could have an episode about it within days. That immediacy gave the show a relevance that no other animated program could match. They mocked the war on terror. They mocked celebrity culture. They mocked both sides of every political debate with equal enthusiasm. They did episodes about immigration, about gun control, about the pharmaceutical industry, about reality television, about literally anything and everything that was happening in American life. And because the show was always punching in every direction at once, it became very difficult for anyone to accuse it of having a specific agenda. But this approach had limits, and those limits became apparent when they started going after not just political topics or social trends, but specific organizations. Organizations with money, lawyers, and a willingness to fight back. Organizations that didn't see the humor in being mocked by a cartoon show and had the resources to do something about it. The first organization to really test South Park's boundaries wasn't a government or a corporation. It was a church. And not just any church. It was one of the most litigious, well-funded, and aggressively protective religious organizations on the planet. Now, I want to be clear about something before we get into this. South Park had been making fun of religion from the very beginning. Jesus Christ was literally a recurring character on the show. They'd done episodes mocking Catholicism, Mormonism, Judaism, and pretty much every major faith you can think of. And the reaction had always been relatively mild. Some people complained. Some organizations issued statements, but nothing that seriously threatened the show's existence. But in November of 2005, they aired an episode that changed everything. It was the 12th episode of season 9, and it was titled Trapped in the Closet. And when I tell you that the fallout from this single episode fundamentally altered the trajectory of the show and the lives of the people who made it, I am not exaggerating even slightly. See, the thing about making fun of Catholicism or Mormonism or Judaism is that those are massive, established religions with centuries of history. They can absorb a few jokes, they might issue a statement, they might call for a boycott, but they're not going to dedicate institutional resources to investigating the personal lives of two cartoon creators. Scientology, on the other hand, is a very different kind of organization, and Parker and Stone were about to find out exactly how different. The decision to do an episode about Scientology wasn't made lightly, but it also wasn't made with any particular fear. Parker and Stone had been making fun of religions for years by that point, and Scientology had always been on their list of targets. They just hadn't gotten around to it yet. When they finally did, they decided to go all in. Not a passing joke, not a brief reference, but an entire episode dedicated to deconstructing the church's beliefs, mocking its most famous members, and essentially daring the organization to do something about it. Parker wrote and directed the episode himself, and he did something that would become one of the episode's most legendary details. In the credits, every single person involved in making the episode was listed as either John Smith or Jane Smith. Every writer, every animator, every voice actor, every producer. All John Smith or Jane Smith. It was a preemptive strike against Scientology's well-known practice of targeting individuals who criticized the church. By hiding everyone's real names, Parker and Stone were protecting their entire team from potential retaliation. And the fact that they felt the need to do that tells you a lot about the kind of organization they were dealing with. The episode aired on November 16th, 2005. And what happened next was one of the most bizarre and fascinating controversies in the history of television. But that story deserves its own section because there is so much to unpack. So let's get into it. So here's what happens in Trapped in the Closet. Stan is walking around town one day and he comes across some Scientologists offering a free personality test. Being a kid with nothing better to do, he takes it. The results come back and his thetan levels, which is a Scientology concept related to spiritual energy, are apparently off the charts. Like the highest ever recorded, the Scientologists are stunned. Word travels up the chain, and pretty soon the president of the Church of Scientology himself shows up at the Marsh family home to deliver the news. According to these test results, Stan is the reincarnation of El. Ron Hubbard, the science fiction writer who founded Scientology. Now, if you know anything about Scientology, you know that Ron Hubbard is essentially the most important figure in the religion. Being identified as his reincarnation is a very, very big deal. So suddenly Stan has hundreds of Scientologists camped outside his house, all waiting for their new leader to emerge and guide them. His parents are confused and unhappy about the whole situation, and things are spiraling. But here's where the episode gets really interesting. While all of this is going on, Stan goes up to his bedroom and finds Tom Cruise waiting for him. Cruise, being a devoted Scientologist, has come to meet the reincarnated Hubbard. He asks Stan what he thinks of his acting, and Stan, being Stan, gives him an honest answer. He says Cruise's acting is okay, it's fine, but it's not as good as some other actors. And this absolutely devastates Cruise. He gets so upset that he locks himself inside Stan's closet and refuses to come out. The rest of the episode becomes this escalating farce where everyone is trying to get Tom Cruise to come out of the closet. Stan's dad is yelling through the door. Nicole Kidman, Cruise's real-life ex-wife, is brought in to try to coax him out. John Travolta shows up and ends up going into the closet too. Kelly appears, parodying his own Trapped in the Closet music video series, pulls out a gun, and also ends up in the closet. The phrase, "Tom Cruise won't come out of the closet," is repeated throughout the episode, and the double meaning is the joke. It's playing on long-standing rumors about Cruise's sexuality, and it's doing it in the most direct, unsubtle way possible, which is very South Park. Meanwhile, the president of Scientology sits Stan down and tells him the actual origin story of the religion. And this is where Parker and Stone did something genuinely brilliant. They animated the real They Knew story. For those who don't know, this is the creation myth at the heart of Scientology's higher-level teachings, the operating thetan materials that members pay enormous amounts of money to access. According to this story, 75 million years ago, an alien ruler named Xenu brought billions of aliens to Earth, stacked them around volcanoes, and killed them with hydrogen bombs. Their souls, called thetans, then attach themselves to living humans and are the source of all human suffering. The only way to remove these thetans is through Scientology's auditing process, which costs a lot of money. Parker and Stone animated this entire story faithfully, exactly as Scientology's own documents describe it. They didn't exaggerate it. They didn't embellish it. They just showed it as it was. And throughout the entire sequence, a caption ran across the bottom of the screen that read, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The genius of this was that the real story was so bizarre, so outlandish, that it genuinely sounded like something South Park would make up as a joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was the actual theology. And putting that disclaimer on screen was Parker and Stone's way of saying, we're not even trying to be funny here. This is just what they believe. You can decide for yourself what to make of it. The episode ends with Stan telling his followers that Scientology is a scam. The president of the church threatens to sue him. Stan's response, delivered directly to camera, is, "Go ahead. Sue me. I dare you." And then the credits roll with every name listed as John Smith or Jane Smith. The response was immediate and intense. The Church of Scientology was furious. But the true extent of their anger wouldn't be fully understood until years later, when a leaked document from a former high-ranking Scientologist revealed that the church had launched a full investigation into Parker and Stone. The document showed that the church's Office of Special Affairs, which is essentially their intelligence division, had conducted surveillance on the South Park production offices. They identified which catering company Parker and Stone used for lunch. They found their parking spaces. They recorded the makes, models, and license plate numbers of their cars. Whether Scientology was ever successful in digging up any actual dirt on the two creators is still unknown. But the fact that they tried, that they dedicated institutional resources to investigating two cartoon makers, tells you everything about how seriously the church took the threat. But the fallout didn't stop there. The biggest casualty of the Scientology episode was someone who had been with the show from the very beginning. Isaac Hayes, the legendary soul musician who voiced the character of Chef, was a devoted Scientologist. And after Trapped in the Closet aired, everything changed. Now, this is where the story gets a little complicated and honestly a little sad. Hayes had been with South Park for 9 years. During that time, the show had relentlessly mocked every religion, every race, every political group, every social movement you can think of. Hayes had been fine with all of it. He'd voiced Chef through episodes that targeted Christians, Muslims, Jews, Mormons, and everyone in between without ever raising a public objection. But when Scientology was the target, suddenly he had a problem. In early 2006, a statement was released in Hayes' name announcing that he was leaving the show. The statement criticized South Park for being intolerant of religious beliefs, which, if you'd watched literally any previous episode of the show, was almost comically ironic. Matt Stone responded publicly by saying that Hayes had been fine with the show making fun of everyone else's beliefs for 9 years, and that it was only when his own religion was criticized that he suddenly discovered a problem with intolerance. But here's where things get really murky. At the time of his supposed resignation, Isaac Hayes had recently suffered a stroke. He was in poor health and, according to multiple reports, was not in a condition to be making major career decisions. Fox News columnist Roger Friedman reported that Hayes was hospitalized and not in a position to make a rational decision to leave the show. The departure statement, it turned out, had been issued by someone who wasn't actually authorized to represent him. The definitive answer came in 2016, when Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, confirmed in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter that his father had been incapacitated at the time and that the decision to leave the show was made by members of his entourage, all of whom were Scientologists. His father, according to his son, did not make that decision. It was made for him by people who were loyal to the church first and to Hayes second. It's a genuinely sad story when you peel back the layers. Here was a man who had been part of something special for nearly a decade, who had helped create one of the most beloved characters in animated television, and who was apparently removed from the show not by his own choice, but by the manipulations of people around him who were more concerned with protecting Scientology than with his career or his wishes. Parker and Stone didn't take it quietly. The first episode of Season 10, which aired in March of 2006, was titled The Return of Chef. Since Hayes was no longer voicing the character, they created the episode by splicing together pieces of old dialogue from previous episodes. The result was a story where Chef returns to South Park after having been brainwashed by a group called the Super Adventure Club, an obvious stand-in for Scientology. Chef says increasingly bizarre and inappropriate things, all assembled from out-of-context snippets of his past lines, and the boys try desperately to save him from the cult's influence. The episode ends with Chef's death, and it's not a subtle death. He gets struck by lightning, catches on fire, falls off a bridge, gets impaled on a tree branch, and is mauled by both a mountain lion and a grizzly bear. Then, in a final twist, the Super Adventure Club retrieves his body and rebuilds him as a Darth Vader-like cyborg. It was brutal, it was funny, and it was a clear message to Scientology. You took our friend from us, and this is how we feel about it. But the controversy around the Scientology episode wasn't done yet. Trapped in the Closet was scheduled to be rebroadcast on March 15, 2006. The rerun was pulled without notice and replaced with a different episode. Comedy Central's official explanation was that they had decided to air a tribute to Isaac Hayes following his departure from the show. Nobody bought that explanation. Reports emerged that Tom Cruise had allegedly threatened to pull out of his promotional obligations for Mission Impossible 3 if the episode aired again. This was significant because Paramount Pictures, which was producing the Mission Impossible film, and Comedy Central were both owned by the same parent company, Viacom. If Cruise walked away from promoting the film, it could have cost Viacom tens of millions of dollars. Cruise's representatives denied the allegations, and Cruise himself later said he would not dignify the rumors by addressing them personally. But the timing was suspicious enough that the story became one of the biggest entertainment news items of the year. Parker and Stone issued one of their most memorable public statements in response. They said, and I'm quoting from memory here, but it's close, "So Scientology, you may have won this battle, but the million-year war for Earth has just begun." It was a reference to Scientology's own mythology, and it was a perfect example of how they handle controversy. They don't retreat. They don't apologize. They make another joke. The episode did eventually return to the air. It later earned an Emmy nomination, and TV Guide ranked it number 17 on their list of the top 100 episodes of all time. Not just of South Park, of all television ever. It became one of the most talked about, most analyzed, and most celebrated episodes in the show's entire run. But here's the thing that I keep coming back to. Throughout all of this, the investigation, the surveillance, the loss of Isaac Hayes, the pulled rebroadcast, the corporate pressure from crews, not once did Parker and Stone back down. Not once did they issue an apology. Not once did they retract anything or say they wished they'd handled it differently. If anything, the whole experience made them more determined to go after the targets that fought back the hardest. And that determination was about to be tested in an even bigger way. Because while the Scientology battle was still fresh, another controversy was brewing. One that didn't involve a church or a celebrity, but the Catholic Church itself. And this one happened almost simultaneously with the Scientology drama, creating a period where South Park was essentially at war on two fronts at the same time. Season 9 of South Park was a particularly wild stretch. Trapped in the Closet was the 12th episode of that season. The 14th and final episode, the season finale, was a little gem called Bloody Mary. And when I say gem, I mean the kind of gem that provokes international boycotts, gets a Viacom board member to issue a public condemnation, draws the involvement of a head of state, and somehow ends up drawing 6 times its normal audience in New Zealand. Yeah, New Zealand gets involved in this one. Let's talk about it. Bloody Mary aired on December 7th, 2005, and the timing was not an accident, though Parker and Stone claim it was a coincidence. December 7th is the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is one of the most significant holy days in the Catholic calendar. It's a day specifically dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Airing an episode that mocks the Virgin Mary on the eve of her most sacred observance was either an incredible coincidence or a deliberate provocation. And knowing Parker and Stone, I have a feeling it was probably a little bit of both. The episode revolves around Randy Marsh, Stan's dad, who is one of the funniest and most chaotic characters on the show. Randy gets pulled over for drunk driving and is ordered by the court to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. At the meetings, he learns about the 12-step program and the idea that alcoholism is a disease that can only be cured through surrender to a higher power. Randy, being Randy, interprets this in the most literal way possible. He decides that if he has a disease, he needs a miracle to cure it. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, a statue of the Virgin Mary has started bleeding. Not from the eyes, which is the traditional weeping statue phenomenon that pops up in religious folklore from time to time. This statue is bleeding from a much less dignified location. The show describes it as bleeding out its ass. People begin flocking to the statue, believing the blood has healing properties. A cardinal is dispatched from Vatican City to investigate, and when he walks behind the statue, he gets sprayed directly in the face with blood. He immediately declares this to be a genuine miracle. Randy hears about this and convinces Stan to drive him to the church. He cuts in line, arguing that his disease is worse than everyone else's ailments, and stands before the statue. He gets absolutely drenched in blood, jumps up, declares himself cured, and goes 5 full days without drinking. Then Pope Benedict XVI arrives to investigate personally, and what he discovers changes everything. The blood isn't coming from the statue's rear end. It's coming from the statue's vagina. The Pope's conclusion is delivered with the kind of deadpan absurdity that South Park does better than anyone. Since chicks bleed out their vaginas all the time, he declares, this is not a miracle at all. It's just menstruation. Nothing special. Randy, devastated that God didn't actually heal him, initially falls back into despair. But Stan follows him and delivers the episode's actual message, which is honestly kind of touching underneath all the grossness. If God didn't cure you, Stan says, that means you stopped drinking on your own. You had the power to do it yourself. You don't need a miracle. You just need to figure out how to live responsibly. Randy agrees, but Stan adds one more thing. If you completely avoid alcohol forever, then alcohol is still controlling your life. The real goal is moderation. Learning to have a drink without it destroying everything. It's actually a pretty nuanced take on addiction when you strip away the crude humor. The episode is really critiquing 2 things. First, it's poking at the tendency of some religious communities to see miracles everywhere, especially in obviously explainable phenomena. And second, It's questioning the AA model's emphasis on powerlessness and divine intervention, suggesting that personal agency and moderation might be more effective than surrendering to a higher power. These are legitimate philosophical and medical debates that have been going on for decades. But that is absolutely not what the Catholic League wanted to talk about. Bill Donahue, the president of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, went nuclear. The Catholic League issued a press release calling the episode an act of defilement against the Blessed Mother. They demanded two things from Viacom, the parent company of Comedy Central. First, a formal apology to Roman Catholics everywhere. Second, a pledge that the episode would be permanently retired and never made available on DVD. They also specifically targeted Joseph A. Califano Jr., a member of Viacom's board of directors who happened to be a practicing Catholic. They essentially put pressure on him to take a personal stand against the episode. Califano responded quickly. He released a statement the very next day calling the episode an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary, and noting that it was particularly troubling that it had aired on the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. He pledged to have the episode reviewed by Viacom's president and CEO, Tom Freston. Bishop William Skylestad, who was at the time the president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, sent a letter directly to Freston saying that the network had shown extreme insensitivity. That's the head of the Catholic Church in America, writing a formal complaint to the CEO of a media corporation about a cartoon show. The institutional weight behind the pushback was enormous, and Comedy Central blinked. When the network re-aired all the episodes of Season 9 on December 28th, just 3 weeks after Bloody Mary originally aired, the episode was conspicuously absent from the lineup. Comedy Central responded to email inquiries by assuring people that the episode had not been officially retired and would still be included on the DVD release. But it was clearly gone from the broadcast schedule, and the timing made it obvious that the Catholic League's pressure campaign had worked, at least temporarily. The Catholic League continued pushing. Bill Donahue's organization called Comedy Central's offices repeatedly, demanding a formal decision about the episode's future. When they heard nothing back, they warned that they would report Viacom's refusal to cooperate to their membership. Finally, on December 29th, they received a phone call from Comedy Central's executive vice president for corporate communications, informing them that there were no plans to rerun Bloody Mary. For a moment, it looked like the Catholic League had won a complete victory. They'd gotten the episode pulled from the broadcast schedule, extracted a condemnation from a Viacom board member, and secured what appeared to be a promise that the episode would not be shown again. But then something happened that no one expected, and it happened on the other side of the world. In February of 2006, news broke that a New Zealand music channel called C4, which was part of the CanWest Media conglomerate, was planning to air Bloody Mary. Leaders from the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference, along with the Council of Christians and Muslims and several other religious groups, lobbied CanWest to cancel the broadcast. The network refused, so the Catholic bishops escalated. They called for a full boycott of C4 and its sister network, TV3, urging parishioners to stop watching and pressuring advertisers to pull their sponsorship. Here's where things get genuinely funny, at least if you appreciate irony. The boycott completely backfired. All the media attention, the protests, the boycott calls, the religious leaders going on the news to condemn the episode, all of it generated massive free publicity for a show that most New Zealand viewers probably wouldn't have paid much attention to otherwise. CanWest, seeing what was happening, actually moved the broadcast date forward to take advantage of the attention. They aired the episode on February 22nd. The result was staggering. Bloody Mary drew 210,000 viewers in New Zealand that night. The normal audience for South Park on C4 was about 32,500, so the episode drew more than 6 times its normal viewership. The Catholic Church's boycott didn't suppress interest. It multiplied it. Even New Zealand's Prime Minister got involved. Helen Clark issued a public statement saying the episode sounded revolting, but she defended the network's right to air it. One advertiser did withdraw their ads from CanWest's networks, and a Catholic group called Family Life International set up a website encouraging people to boycott CanWest's other advertisers. But the damage, if you can call it that, was already done. The episode had aired, more people had seen it than ever would have otherwise, and the controversy had only made South Park more famous. There was even a bizarre side story where a completely unrelated New Zealand company called C4 Productions, which had nothing to do with the C4 music channel, tried to get a court order to stop the broadcast because they were worried people would confuse the two businesses and associate them with the controversy. The judge rejected the request. After the broadcast, C4 received 102 formal complaints from viewers. The network issued a statement acknowledging the strength of feeling around the episode, but they didn't apologize for airing it. The complaints were eventually reviewed by New Zealand's Broadcasting Standards Authority, which is the government body that oversees broadcast content in the country. In June of 2006, they rejected every single complaint. Their ruling stated that showing disrespect does not amount to the sort of vicious or vitriolic attack normally associated with the denigration standard. They also noted that the episode was of such a farcical, absurd, and unrealistic nature that it did not breach standards of good taste and decency in the context in which it was offered. That's a regulatory body officially ruling that a cartoon depicting the Virgin Mary having her period on the Pope's face was legitimate satire protected by free expression standards, which honestly is one of the most incredible sentences I've ever had to type. The New Zealand Catholic bishops appealed the decision, but the whole thing had already become a perfect case study in what would later become known as the Streisand effect, named after an incident where Barbra Streisand's attempt to suppress photographs of her Malibu home only drew more attention to them. And ironically enough, South Park had also mocked Barbra Streisand in one of their very early episodes, depicting her as a giant destructive monster. So there's a nice little circle of irony there. Bloody Mary did eventually return to the Comedy Central broadcast schedule on August 2nd, 2006. Similar situations played out in Australia, where the SBS network initially planned to air the episode, then postponed it due to the broader controversy around the Jyllands-Posten Mohammed cartoons in Denmark, then eventually aired it later that year on a different channel. Parker and Stone, true to form, revealed in the DVD commentary that the inspiration for the episode came from Anne Garofino, a producer on the show who is herself Catholic. They'd been discussing the phenomenon of weeping statues and how they could use it in an episode. And according to Parker and Stone, it was Garofino who suggested the, let's say, anatomical specifics of how the statue would bleed. They also mentioned that Randy's DUI arrest at the beginning of the episode was based on a real experience that Parker had as a child, when his own father had a similar incident. So that's two major religious organizations that South Park had now tangled with in the space of a single season, Scientology and the Catholic Church. Both had used their institutional power to try to suppress the show. Both had tried to get episodes pulled from the air. Both had failed in the long run. And both had inadvertently made the show more popular and more culturally relevant by drawing attention to the very content they wanted to bury. You'd think, after taking on Scientology and Catholicism back to back, that Parker and Stone might have learned something about picking fights with organized religions. But you'd be wrong, because what came next was on a completely different level. The Scientology fight was about a litigious church and some corporate pressure. The Catholic fight was about moral outrage and boycotts. What was coming next would involve actual death threats, police protection, the FBI, and a controversy so severe that the episodes at its center have been banned from every streaming platform and television broadcast for over 15 years, and they're still banned today. So let me tell you about the time South Park almost got its creators killed. To understand why the Muhammad episodes became the single most dangerous moment in South Park's history, you have to understand the broader context of what was happening in the world at the time. Because this wasn't just about a cartoon show making a joke. This was about a fault line that had been forming in global culture for years. One that ran between free expression and religious sensitivity, between Western ideas about satire and Islamic prohibitions against depicting the Prophet Muhammad in any visual form. And South Park walked right into the middle of it. Let's start with something that a lot of people forget or never knew in the first place. South Park actually depicted Muhammad years before any of the controversy happened, and nobody cared. In July of 2001, the show aired an episode called Super Best Friends in Season 5. The plot involves the boys getting sucked into a cult run by magician David Blaine. Stan sees through the manipulation and tries to rescue his friends, so he goes to Jesus for help. Jesus can't handle it alone, so he calls in reinforcements. Enter the Super Best Friends, which is basically a Justice League parody made up of religious figures. The team includes Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, Lao Tzu, and Muhammad. Muhammad is right there, fully depicted with a speaking role and superpowers. His power was controlling fire. He's drawn in the same crude South Park style as every other character, and he participates in the episode just like everyone else. And the response at the time was basically nothing. Nobody protested, nobody complained, nobody issued threats. The episode aired, people watched it, some people laughed, and everyone moved on. Muhammad was just another character in the ensemble, treated exactly the same as Jesus and Buddha and all the rest. The episode stayed in the rerun rotation for years without anyone raising an issue about it. Then the world changed. On September 11th, 2001, just 2 months after Super Best Friends aired, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon happened. Everything shifted. The relationship between Western culture and Islam became exponentially more complicated, more tense, and more politically charged. In the years that followed, as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq escalated, tensions between Western nations and parts of the Muslim world grew deeper and sharper. Then, in September of 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons depicting Muhammad. In several Islamic traditions, any visual depiction of the Prophet Muhammad is considered deeply disrespectful and forbidden. The cartoons, some of which were deliberately provocative, sparked a massive international crisis. There were protests in countries across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Danish embassies were attacked. People died in the resulting violence. Death threats were issued against the cartoonists, some of whom had to go into hiding with police protection. The Danish Prime Minister called it the worst international crisis for Denmark since World War II. The Muhammad cartoons controversy reshaped the media landscape overnight. Newspapers and television networks that had previously shown anything and everything suddenly became extremely cautious about any content related to Islam or Muhammad. Self-censorship became the norm. Publishers pulled books. Galleries removed artwork. Television networks adopted unwritten policies about what could and couldn't be shown. The fear was real. People had been killed over these depictions. This wasn't a theoretical concern. And this is the environment in which Trey Parker and Matt Stone decided to make their next move. In April of 2006, just months after the Danish cartoon crisis was still making headlines, South Park aired a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The premise was perfectly constructed for maximum provocation. In the story, the Fox network is about to air an episode of Family Guy that includes a depiction of Muhammad. Cartman, who hates Family Guy for reasons that have nothing to do with religion, launches a campaign to get the episode pulled from the air. Kyle argues passionately that the episode should air, that censoring it would be surrendering to intimidation, and that free speech means nothing if it only protects speech that doesn't offend anyone. The episodes were simultaneously a satire of the Danish cartoons crisis, a commentary on the cowardice of media self-censorship, and a not-so-subtle challenge to their own network. Because the real question at the heart of Cartoon Wars wasn't whether Family Guy should show Muhammad. It was whether Comedy Central would let South Park show Muhammad. When the episodes aired, the moment arrived where Muhammad was supposed to appear on screen. Instead, viewers saw a black screen with text that read, "Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network." Parker and Stone did not write that card. Comedy Central inserted it themselves. The network had looked at what was happening in the world, considered the potential consequences, and decided that no, they would not air a depiction of Muhammad, even on a show that had mocked literally every other religious figure without restriction. Parker and Stone were furious, and they said so publicly. Matt Stone did an interview with the Huffington Post where he talked about watching institution after institution, from the New York Times to Comedy Central, fold under pressure and refuse to show images that they had every legal right to show. He said something that stuck with me. He said, cartoonists, people who do satire, we're not in the army, we're never going to be drafted, and this is our time to stand up and do the right thing. And to watch the New York Times, Comedy Central, everybody just go, no, we're not going to do it, because basically we're afraid of getting bombed. That sucked. And here's the profound irony of the whole situation. At the time Cartoon Wars aired and Comedy Central was refusing to show Muhammad, the episode Super Best Friends from 2001, the one where Muhammad was fully depicted with fire powers and everything, was still available on the South Park Studios website and was still airing in reruns. Nobody had pulled it. Nobody had complained about it. The same network that was refusing to show a new image of Muhammad was still broadcasting an old image of him every time the episode came around in the rotation. Parker and Stone pointed this out repeatedly, and it drove them crazy. The inconsistency, the arbitrary nature of the censorship, the fact that the rules seemed to change based on whatever the current threat level was rather than on any coherent principle, all of it grated on them. But they didn't let it go, not even close. If anything, the experience of being censored on Cartoon Wars made them more determined to push the issue. They spent the next 4 years thinking about how to come back to it, how to make a statement that couldn't be ignored, how to force the conversation about censorship and free speech into the open. And in 2010, they found their moment. The show was approaching its 200th episode, which is a massive milestone for any television series. Parker and Stone decided that the best way to celebrate was to bring back everything. Every past storyline, every old character, every unresolved thread from the show's history. And at the center of it all, they put the one thing they'd been told they couldn't show: Muhammad. The 200th episode, simply titled 200, aired on April 14th, 2010. The plot is deceptively simple. Tom Cruise, who has never forgiven South Park for Trapped in the Closet, assembles a group of every celebrity the show has ever mocked. We're talking hundreds of them. They're all planning to file a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park for the damage the show has done to their careers over the years. Cruise's condition for dropping the lawsuit is specific and strange. He wants the people of South Park to bring him Muhammad, not because he cares about religion, because he believes Muhammad has a special power, a power that prevents anyone from showing his image or making fun of him. Cruise wants that power for himself. He's tired of being mocked, and if Muhammad can be immune to ridicule, Cruise wants that immunity too. It's a brilliant setup because it takes the real-world censorship issue and turns it into a literal plot device. The reason you can't show Muhammad isn't treated as a religious prohibition. It's treated as a superpower, and everyone wants it. The celebrities want it. The gingers want it. Everyone in the South Park universe is fighting over the ability to be immune from mockery. Muhammad does appear in the episode, but his image is obscured. He's wearing a bear suit that hides his entire body and face. It's played as a compromise, a way to include the character without technically showing him. The Super Best Friends return, the same team from the 2001 episode, and they try to protect Muhammad from all the factions trying to capture him. The episode is packed with callbacks and references to over a decade of South Park history. It's celebratory and chaotic, and clearly designed to be a love letter to the show's past. But it's also very clearly building towards something. The Muhammad issue is front and center, and everything about the episode is structured as a provocation aimed directly at Comedy Central and at the broader culture of fear and censorship that had developed since the Danish cartoons controversy. When 200 aired, the response was almost immediate. The Council on American Islamic Relations, a major civil rights and advocacy group based in Washington, D.C., said they were aware of the episode but declined to put out a formal statement. Their spokesman said, "People are pretty tired of this whole, let's insult the Prophet Muhammad thing." That was the moderate response. The extreme response came from somewhere else entirely. And it was the kind of response that would change everything about how the show operated and how its creators lived their lives. A New York-based organization called Revolution Muslim posted an entry on their website that crossed a line from criticism into something much darker. The post stated that Parker and Stone would probably wind up like Theo van Gogh for airing the show. Theo van Gogh was a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered on an Amsterdam street in 2004 by a radical Islamist who was angry about a film Van Gogh had made about violence against women in some Islamic societies. The killer had shot Van Gogh, then stabbed him, then used a knife to pin a threatening note to his body. The Revolution Muslim post didn't just reference Van Gogh. It included a graphic photograph of his murdered body. It listed the addresses of Comedy Central's New York offices and Parker and Stone's California production company. It featured audio clips of a sermon by Anwar al-Awlaki, an al-Qaeda imam who was calling for the assassination of anyone who defamed Muhammad. The sermon included the words, "Harming Allah and his messenger is a reason to encourage Muslims to kill whoever does that." And it posted photographs of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, an activist and critic of Islam who lived in permanent security protection because of threats against her life. The author of the post, a man who went by the name Abu Talha al-Amraki and whose real name was Zachary Chesser, later told the Associated Press that the post was written to raise awareness and that Parker and Stone should feel threatened by what they did. When pressed on whether that constituted a direct threat, he said it wasn't a threat, just a warning of the reality of what will likely happen to them. One of Revolution Muslim's members also posted on Twitter, "May Allah kill Matt Stone and Trey Parker and burn them in hell for all eternity. They insult our prophets Muhammad, Jesus, and Moses." This was no longer a conversation about taste or offense or corporate censorship. This was a conversation about physical safety, about whether two people might actually be killed for making a cartoon. The New York City Police Department immediately increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters. The FBI began investigating the threats. Law enforcement officials noted that while Revolution Muslim itself was considered to be all talk and had never engaged in actual violence, the concern was that their public posts could inspire violence from others. It was a credible enough threat that armed security was deployed. Meanwhile, Parker and Stone had to decide what to do. The episode 201 was already written. It was scheduled to air the following week. The question was whether to air it as written, modify it, or pull it entirely. And that question wasn't just about creative integrity anymore. It was about the physical safety of everyone at Comedy Central. This is where the story takes its darkest turn, and we'll get into exactly what happened next. Episode 201 aired on April 21st, 2010, exactly 1 week after 200. But what aired that night was not the episode that Parker and Stone had created. What viewers saw was a heavily censored version, altered not by the show's creators but by Comedy Central itself, without Parker and Stone's approval. Every single reference to Muhammad's name was bleeped out. Not just in one scene, in every scene throughout the entire episode. Every time a character said Muhammad, the audio was replaced with a bleep. But it went further than that. The episode's closing speech, the one where Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus deliver the moral of the story, was almost entirely censored. The bleeps covered multiple consecutive minutes of dialogue. Large portions of the episode were just silence broken by bleeps, with the characters' mouths moving but no words coming through. Viewers watching at home had no idea what was happening. Some thought it was a meta joke, a deliberate creative choice by Parker and Stone to comment on censorship by literally censoring their own episode. That would have been very on brand for them. But it wasn't a joke. The day after the episode aired, Parker and Stone released a statement that made the situation clear. They said that in 14 years of making South Park, they had never once delivered an episode that they couldn't stand behind. They explained that Kyle's final speech was about intimidation and fear. It didn't even mention Muhammad. But Comedy Central had bleeped it anyway, along with everything else. It wasn't some meta joke on our part, they said. We delivered our version of the show and Comedy Central altered it. That statement is significant because it reveals just how far the network was willing to go. They didn't just censor the controversial content. They censored the speech about censorship. Kyle's closing monologue, which was supposed to be the entire point of the 2-episode arc, was about how threatening people with violence is the ultimate form of censorship, and about how society had learned to do the censoring itself out of preemptive fear. Comedy Central proved the point of the speech by censoring the speech. The full text of Kyle's censored monologue wouldn't be publicly available for years. In January of 2014, a user on the image board website 4chan discovered that an uncensored version of the episode still existed on the official South Park Studios web server and could be downloaded using a specific technical tool. The file was distributed across the internet, and for the first time, people could hear what Kyle actually said. The speech went like this, as best as I can summarize it without reciting the whole thing. Kyle tells the other characters that there's no magic power that makes someone immune to ridicule. The only power is the power of threatening people with violence. Throughout the whole ordeal, Kyle says everyone wanted to show things they weren't allowed to show. But the reason they couldn't show those things wasn't because of some supernatural force. It was because violence had become the ultimate veto. If you threaten to hurt people, they'll stop saying whatever you don't want them to say. That's not a religious principle. That's just fear. It's a remarkably clear and direct statement about free speech, and the fact that it was censored by the very network airing it is one of the most darkly ironic moments in television history. Parker and Stone were making a show about how threats suppress free expression, and the network suppressed their free expression because of threats. The snake ate its own tail. After the broadcast, things moved quickly. Comedy Central removed both 200 and 201 from their website and from the rerun schedule. They also retroactively pulled Super Best Friends from 2001, the one where Muhammad had appeared without controversy for 9 years. And they pulled both parts of Cartoon Wars from 2006. In total, 5 episodes of South Park were banned from broadcast and removed from all streaming platforms. They were also removed from DVD box sets. If you bought the complete Season 14 collection, episodes 200 and 201 simply were not included. As of right now, today, those 5 episodes remain banned. You cannot watch them on any official streaming platform. You cannot buy them digitally. The only legal way to access them is on the original DVD releases that were manufactured before the ban, and even those are increasingly rare. The episodes exist, of course. They've been leaked and shared online for years. But officially, from Comedy Central's perspective, they don't exist. A Zogby international poll conducted after 201 aired found that 71% of Americans disagreed with Comedy Central's decision to censor the episode. Only 19% agreed with it. And of those who disagreed, 47% said they disagreed strongly, while only 5% of those who agreed felt strongly about it. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on the side of showing the episodes uncensored. But public opinion doesn't matter much when people are sending death threats and the police are standing guard outside your building. The aftermath of the Muhammad episodes rippled outward for years. Zachary Chesser, the man who had written the Revolution Muslim post comparing Parker and Stone to Theo Van Gogh, was eventually arrested and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, though not solely for the South Park threats. He was convicted of providing material support to a terrorist organization and soliciting others to commit violence. The South Park threats were part of a broader pattern of extremist activity. There was even a brief period where some people connected the South Park threats to the failed car bombing in Times Square on May 1st, 2010, just 10 days after 201 aired. U.S. Congressman Peter T. King described the South Park controversy as one possible motive out of 100. NYPD Commissioner Raymond Kelly said they certainly wouldn't rule that out. Revolution Muslim denied any involvement, and the suspect who was eventually arrested, Faisal Shahzad, appeared to have been planning the attack for months before the South Park episodes aired. The connection was never proven, but the fact that it was even discussed shows how seriously the threat was taken. Jon Stewart devoted a 10-minute segment on The Daily Show to the controversy, expressing disgust at what he called the hypocrisy of Revolution Muslims members enjoying American freedoms and lifestyles, while threatening violence against people exercising those same freedoms. The segment was one of the most passionate and direct moments in Stewart's career, and it resonated with a lot of people who felt that Comedy Central had caved to intimidation. Commentary from media critics and free speech advocates was overwhelmingly critical of Comedy Central's decision. Michael Kavanagh of The Washington Post wrote, to invoke the revivified phrase, "the terrorists win." Toronto Sun columnist Mike Strobel pointed out that Revolution Muslim was a relatively small group, a half-dozen wannabe Osamas. But because Comedy Central responded to their threats by censoring the episodes, these few individuals had effectively joined Parker and Stone on South Park's creative team. They had gained editorial control over one of the biggest shows on television simply by being willing to threaten violence. NPR published a piece from Nina Shea arguing that Comedy Central's censorship was the latest evidence that Western institutions were slowly surrendering institution by institution to intimidation. She noted that Comedy Central had joined Yale University Press, Random House, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art on a growing list of organizations that had let extremists make decisions about what they could show and say. It's worth sitting with all of that for a moment, because it really is one of the most complicated and troubling episodes in the history of American media. On one hand, Comedy Central had a genuine responsibility to protect its employees. The threats weren't abstract. People had actually been killed for similar depictions. Theo van Gogh was dead. The Danish cartoonists were living under police protection. This was real danger, and Comedy Central's executives had to consider what might happen if someone walked into their building with a weapon. On the other hand, every time a network or publisher or institution censors itself in response to threats, it validates the strategy. It tells anyone who objects to any piece of content that the way to get it removed is not through argument or protest or legal action, but through fear. And that's a precedent that has consequences far beyond any single cartoon episode. Parker and Stone themselves have been relatively measured in how they talk about it, at least publicly. They were clearly angry at the time, and their statement about the censorship was blunt and direct. But they didn't leave the show. They didn't refuse to work with Comedy Central going forward. They finished the season, came back for the next one, and kept making South Park. In their own way, they acknowledged the reality of the situation. Sometimes you can't win every fight. Sometimes the forces arrayed against you are too large and too dangerous, and the best you can do is make your point and move on. But they did make their point. The fact that we're sitting here talking about these episodes 15 years later, the fact that the banned episodes have become some of the most discussed and analyzed pieces of television in history, the fact that the censorship itself became the story rather than any specific image or joke, all of that is proof that Parker and Stone's fundamental argument was right. Censorship doesn't make ideas go away. It makes them more interesting. It makes people more curious. It makes the censored content more valuable, not less. And here's something I think about a lot. Muhammad had been shown on South Park in 2001 without anyone caring. He'd appeared in a completely uncontroversial episode that aired and re-aired for years without a single complaint. The only reason those later episodes became dangerous was because the world had changed around them. The same content that was harmless in 2001 was deadly in 2010. Not because the content itself had changed, but because the environment had. That says something important about the nature of controversy. It's not always about what you say. Sometimes it's about when you say it. And for Parker and Stone, the timing of their Muhammad episodes placed them at the exact intersection of the biggest cultural and geopolitical tensions of the 21st century. Two guys from Colorado who just wanted to make a funny cartoon found themselves at the center of a global debate about faith, freedom, fear, and violence. And somehow, despite all of it, they came out the other side and kept going. The show's statement at the end of that season was characteristically brief. They said they'd be back next week with a whole new show about something completely different, and they'd see what happened to it. And that's exactly what they did. They came back, they made more episodes, and they kept pushing the boundaries of what was possible on television. But the Muhammad saga left a permanent mark, not just on South Park, but on the entire entertainment industry. It demonstrated in the starkest possible terms what happens when free expression collides with the threat of real-world violence. And the answer, unfortunately, is that free expression often loses. Those 5 banned episodes sit there like a gap in the show's history, a reminder that there are limits to what even the most fearless satirist can achieve when the opposition isn't just offended but genuinely dangerous. Parker and Stone can fight Scientology, they can fight the Catholic League, they can fight Tom Cruise and the MPAA and school boards and parent councils. But they can't fight bullets. Nobody can. And yet, despite everything, the show survived. It survived the death threats and the censorship and the bans. It survived the loss of Chef and the pulled episodes and the police protection. And it kept going. Season after season, year after year, controversy after controversy. Which raises an interesting question. After taking on Scientology, the Catholic Church, and radical Islamic extremists, after literally risking their lives for the right to make jokes, what else was there? Where do you go from there? The answer, as it turned out, was everywhere. Because while the religious controversies were the ones that generated the most heat, they were far from the only battles South Park fought. There were celebrity feuds, racial controversies, entire countries getting involved. And each one of those stories is worth telling. So let's talk about the other controversies. The ones that didn't involve organized religion or death threats, but were still explosive enough to generate national headlines, international incidents, and enough angry phone calls to Comedy Central to keep their switchboard operators busy for weeks. Because here's the thing about South Park. The religious controversies get the most attention because the stakes were so high and the consequences were so dramatic. But the show has been offending people in every possible direction for its entire run. And some of those offenses, the ones that targeted celebrities, racial issues, and cultural sacred cows, were just as significant in terms of shaping the show's reputation and testing its boundaries. Let's start with the celebrities, because South Park has absolutely demolished more famous people than basically any other show in television history. And unlike a lot of shows that do celebrity parody, South Park doesn't do gentle ribbing. They go for the throat. They exaggerate, they distort. They take the worst things people suspect about a celebrity and blow them up to absurd proportions. And they do it with the specific names and likenesses of real, living people, which is a level of directness that most shows won't touch. One of the most notorious celebrity episodes was The Jeffersons from season 8, which aired in April of 2004. The episode is South Park's Michael Jackson takedown. In the story, a man calling himself Mr. Jefferson moves to South Park with his son Blanket. The name is obviously fake, and everything about Mr. Jefferson screams Michael Jackson. He's had extensive plastic surgery, he speaks in a high-pitched voice, he has a massive mansion filled with carnival rides and toys, and he spends all his time playing with children in ways that make the adults of South Park deeply uncomfortable. The episode was savage in its characterization. It depicted Jackson as someone so disconnected from reality, so childlike and irresponsible, that he was incapable of properly caring for his own son. Meanwhile, the South Park Police Department, led by Sergeant Harrison Yates, becomes fixated on framing Mr. Jefferson for crimes simply because he's a wealthy black man, which was the episode's way of satirizing both Jackson's legal troubles and the racial dynamics of celebrity prosecution. The episode aired months before Jackson's actual child molestation trial began, and it managed to touch on virtually every aspect of the Jackson controversy. The plastic surgery, the accusations of inappropriate behavior with children, the racial dynamics of his legal situation, the Neverland Ranch lifestyle, all of it was in there. Jackson was reportedly upset about the episode, though there was no public response from his camp. What's remarkable is that the episode remains one of the most watched and most discussed South Park episodes ever. And looking back at it now, after everything that's come to light about Jackson in the years since, the episode feels almost restrained compared to the reality. But Jackson was far from the only celebrity to get the South Park treatment. Over the years, the show has gone after Kanye West, depicting him as someone so lacking in self-awareness that he can't understand a joke about gay fish. They've mocked Mel Gibson, showing him as a deranged masochist who literally chases the boys through the streets. They've taken shots at Paris Hilton, depicting her as so vapid that she accidentally encourages children to become stupid, spoiled whores. They turned Barbra Streisand into a giant mechanical monster that destroys cities, which is actually one of the earliest celebrity parodies from the show's first season and has become a recurring reference. Rob Reiner, Al Gore, Bono from U2, Jennifer Lopez, Russell Crowe, they've all been depicted in ways that range from mildly unflattering to completely humiliating, and the show's approach is always the same. They take one specific trait or controversy associated with the celebrity and amplify it to the point of absurdity. Kanye's ego becomes a clinical inability to understand simple jokes. Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ becomes evidence of genuine insanity. Paris Hilton's celebrity becomes a cultural toxin that literally corrupts children. What makes South Park's celebrity satire different from, say, Saturday Night Live's is the permanence of it. An SNL sketch airs once and fades away. A South Park episode lives forever on streaming platforms and in reruns. The characterizations become part of how people think about these celebrities. There's an entire generation of people who can't hear the phrase gay fish without thinking of Kanye West. That's the kind of cultural penetration that makes celebrities and their publicists very nervous. Now let's move on to something more serious, because celebrity mockery is one thing. Racial content is a completely different arena, and South Park has waded into it with a fearlessness that has generated some of the show's most controversial and, in some cases, most insightful episodes. The biggest flashpoint came in 2007 with the season 11 premiere, with apologies to Jesse Jackson. The episode was built around a single, incredibly charged moment. Randy Marsh appears on the game show Wheel of Fortune. The category is People Who Annoy You. The letters on the board spell out N-G-G-E-R-S. The answer is naggers. Randy, in front of a live television audience, says the other word. The actual word, not bleeped, not obscured, said out loud on national television within the context of the show. The aftermath within the episode follows Randy as he tries to deal with the consequences. He goes on a national apology tour, literally kissing Jesse Jackson's rear end as a public act of contrition. Meanwhile, the episode explores how white people center themselves in conversations about racism, making the issue about their own guilt and discomfort rather than about the actual impact on Black people. There's a subplot involving a little person who tries to explain to Cartman how harmful slurs are, only to be dismissed and mocked, which parallels how real conversations about offensive language often play out. The N-word was used 43 times in the episode. 43 times. The Parents Television Council, which is a media watchdog group that has been one of South Park's most persistent critics over the years, absolutely condemned it. They called it irresponsible and gratuitously offensive. But here's what's interesting. The episode was never censored. Comedy Central, the same network that would later bleep every mention of Muhammad's name, let the N-word air 43 times without interference. Why? Because they recognized what Parker and Stone were doing. The episode wasn't using the word for shock value. It was using the word to make a point about how the word functions in American culture, about who gets to use it, about the performative nature of white guilt, and about how apologies for racist behavior often miss the point entirely. The episode is actually quite sophisticated in its racial commentary, even though it's wrapped in the show's typical crude packaging. Randy's apology tour is a satire of how public figures handle racial controversies. They apologize, they make grand gestures, they perform contrition, but they never actually engage with the underlying issues. The episode's message is that saying sorry isn't enough if you don't understand what you're sorry for, and that making the conversation about your own feelings of guilt is itself a form of self-centeredness. Then there was The China Problem from season 12 in 2008. This episode was controversial for two completely different reasons. First, it featured Butters and Cartman dressed in stereotypical Chinese clothing, doing exaggerated impressions of Chinese people. That alone would have generated complaints. But the thing that really set people off was an extended sequence depicting the sexual assault of Indiana Jones by his creators, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. The metaphor was about the fourth Indiana Jones film, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which Parker and Stone and a huge portion of the fan base felt had destroyed the franchise. The episode depicted Lucas and Spielberg literally, graphically violating Indiana Jones in scenes that parodied specific moments from famous assault scenes in other films. It was extremely graphic for an animated show, deliberately uncomfortable to watch, and the point was clear. Parker and Stone felt that making that movie was an act of creative violence against a beloved character, and they expressed that feeling in the most visceral way possible. Another episode that deserves attention is Cripple Fight from season 5. which aired way back in 2001. This one featured a lengthy, brutal fight between Timmy and Jimmy, two characters who both have disabilities. The fight was a near shot-for-shot recreation of the famous alley fight from the John Carpenter film They Live, starring Roddy Piper and Keith David. It was long, it was violent, and it was performed by two animated characters in wheelchairs. The build-up to the fight was loaded with the kind of language that made people squirm. Characters referred to one of the boys as the coolest kid with disabilities in the world and praised him for using comedy to overcome his handicap. Cartman naturally screamed, "Cripple fight," at every opportunity and whipped the entire town into a frenzy over the spectacle. The episode was undeniably controversial, but it was also doing something that very few other shows were willing to do at the time, which was treating disabled characters as fully realized people rather than objects of pity or inspiration. Timmy and Jimmy weren't being protected from conflict because of their disabilities. They were fighting, they were competing, they were having a genuine rivalry. In a strange way, the episode was more respectful of disabled people than shows that treated them with kid gloves, because it acknowledged that disabled people can be competitive, jealous, aggressive, and petty, just like everyone else. Moving forward a decade, Crack Baby Athletic Association from season 15 in 2011 was another lightning rod. The episode featured Cartman creating a league where crack-addicted babies played basketball, exploiting them for profit. He compared the NCAA's treatment of unpaid college athletes to slavery. And the crack baby imagery was genuinely disturbing even by South Park standards. But the underlying point was sharp. The NCAA was generating billions of dollars in revenue from college athletes who weren't allowed to be paid. And the episode was arguing that this system was fundamentally exploitative. And then there was China. In 2019, South Park aired Banned in China in season 23. And the response was unlike anything the show had experienced before. The episode satirized Hollywood's increasing willingness to censor itself to maintain access to the Chinese market. It depicted Winnie the Pooh in a Chinese prison, a reference to the Chinese government's ban on the character because of viral internet comparisons between Pooh and President Xi Jinping. China's response was swift and total. Within days of the episode airing, South Park was scrubbed from the Chinese internet. Every clip, every mention, every discussion of the show was removed from Chinese social media platforms, search engines, and streaming services. The show was effectively erased from the largest country on Earth. Parker and Stone responded with what has become one of the most quoted statements in recent pop culture history. They issued a mock apology that read, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. She doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all." Tune into our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn's sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China? The statement was perfect. It was sarcastic, it was direct, and it perfectly highlighted the absurdity of American companies bending over backwards to appease an authoritarian government. It went viral almost immediately and became one of the defining cultural moments of 2019. What I find fascinating about the China ban is that it's the only case where an entire country effectively canceled South Park. Not a specific episode, not a temporary ban, not a boycott. A total erasure. And it happened not because of anything particularly graphic or offensive in the episode itself, but because the episode dared to criticize a government that doesn't tolerate criticism. There have been other international incidents too, though none quite as dramatic as the China ban. Shin Pokemon from season 3 was banned in Japan because of its references to Emperor Hirohito and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Christmas Snow was banned in several countries because it depicted Santa Claus and Jesus Christ using cocaine. Various episodes have been banned or censored in Russia, Sri Lanka, and other countries for reasons ranging from religious sensitivity to political content. The running theme through all of these controversies is that South Park's commentary works precisely because it makes people uncomfortable. The show doesn't just observe social hypocrisy, it performs it, amplifies it, and forces the audience to sit with it. When they use the N-word 43 times, they're not endorsing racism. They're forcing you to confront how the word functions and how people react to it. When they depict crack babies playing basketball, they're not celebrating exploitation. They're making you see the NCAA's business model in its ugliest possible light. That approach doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes the shock value overwhelms the message. Sometimes the satire is too blunt or too crude to land effectively. But more often than not, South Park manages to say something genuinely meaningful while disguising it inside the most offensive packaging imaginable. And the controversies, the outrage, the protests, the bans, all of that is part of how the message gets amplified. Every time someone tries to shut South Park down, they make the show's point for it. But through all of this, through nearly 3 decades of controversy and outrage and institutional pushback, one question keeps coming up. How is this show still on the air? How has it survived everything that's been thrown at it? How have 2 guys from Colorado managed to insult virtually everyone on Earth and somehow still be making new episodes? That's actually a really interesting question with a really interesting answer. So why didn't South Park get canceled? It's a fair question. If you just look at the list of things the show has done, the organizations it's antagonized, the people it's offended, the countries it's been banned in, the actual death threats its creators have received, it seems impossible that it's still on the air. Other shows have been canceled for far less. A single controversial tweet from a cast member can end a show today. A poorly timed joke, an advertiser boycott, a shift in public sentiment, any of these things can kill a television series overnight. And yet South Park, which has done all of those things and worse, just keeps going. The answer, like most things in the entertainment industry, comes down to money. But it's more nuanced than that, so let me walk you through it. First, you have to understand what South Park means to Comedy Central and its parent companies. When the show debuted in 1997, Comedy Central was a nothing network. They had a few million subscribers and no must-watch programming. Within a year of South Park's premiere, the network had gone from 9 million households to 50 million. Advertising rates during the show went from $7,500 for 30 seconds to $80,000. Merchandise sales topped $150 million in the first year alone. South Park didn't just help Comedy Central. It built Comedy Central. Without South Park, there's a very real argument that Comedy Central as we know it would not exist. That created a power dynamic that has defined the entire relationship between the show and the network for almost 30 years. Comedy Central needs South Park more than South Park needs Comedy Central. Parker and Stone have always known this, and they've leveraged it ruthlessly. Every time the network has tried to censor something, every time an executive has suggested they tone it down, Parker and Stone have had the ultimate bargaining chip. If you push too hard, we walk. And if we walk, you lose the show that built your network. This dynamic played out in every major controversy. When the Scientology episode was pulled from reruns, Parker and Stone made their displeasure public, and the episode eventually returned. When Comedy Central censored the Muhammad episodes, Parker and Stone issued a public statement making clear that the censorship was the network's decision, not theirs. They didn't quit, but they made sure everyone knew they were unhappy. And Comedy Central absorbed the criticism because the alternative, losing South Park, was unthinkable. The financial numbers have only gotten more extreme over time. In August of 2021, Viacom CBS, which is the corporate parent of Comedy Central, signed a deal with Parker and Stone worth $900 million. Let me say that again, $900 million. The deal extended their relationship through at least 26 seasons of the show, plus 14 made-for-streaming movies for Paramount+. It was one of the largest deals in television history, and it sent a very clear message. South Park was not going anywhere, no matter how many controversies it generated. To put that number in perspective, $900 million is more than the GDP of some small countries. It's more than most major film franchises have earned in their entire existence. And it was paid to 2 guys who had spent the previous 24 years making Comedy Central's life extremely difficult. But the network paid it gladly because South Park is worth more than the sum of its controversies. The show drives subscriptions, it generates ad revenue, it sells merchandise, and it keeps the Comedy Central brand culturally relevant in a way that nothing else on the network can match. But money is only part of the story. The other reason South Park has survived is something more subtle and more interesting. It's the show's strategy of equal opportunity offense. Think about it from a corporate perspective. If South Park only went after one group, one religion, one political party, one demographic, it would be easy to cancel. You'd have a clearly identified victim group, a clear narrative of bias, and a clear path to corporate consequences. Advertisers would pull out because they wouldn't want to be associated with targeting a specific community. Advocacy groups would organize effective boycotts. Politicians would get involved. The pressure would be focused and sustained. But South Park doesn't target one group. It targets everyone. And that makes organized opposition almost impossible. When the Catholic League complained about Bloody Mary, Parker and Stone could point to all the episodes mocking Protestantism, Judaism, Mormonism, and every other faith. When one political party accused the show of bias, supporters of the other party would jump in to point out all the episodes mocking their opponents. The show's offense is so evenly distributed that no single group can build enough momentum to shut it down, because every potential opponent is also a potential ally against some other group the show has mocked. This isn't an accident. Parker and Stone have talked about it explicitly. They've said that the only way they can continue to mock everyone is by never exempting anyone. The moment they spare one group from criticism, they lose their defense against every other group. If they agreed to never joke about Scientology, every other religion would demand the same treatment. If they agreed to never use racial slurs, every other form of offensive content would become harder to justify. Their only consistent position is inconsistency. They refuse to draw any lines because any line they drew would be used against them. There's also something Parker and Stone figured out early on that a lot of people in media still don't fully understand. Controversy is not the opposite of popularity. For South Park, controversy is the engine of popularity. Every time a group tries to suppress or ban the show, it generates massive free publicity that drives viewership. The Scientology controversy made Trapped in the Closet one of the most watched episodes in the show's history. The Catholic League's boycott of Bloody Mary made it the highest-rated South Park episode in New Zealand by a factor of 6. The China ban turned Banned in China into an international news story that millions of people who had never watched South Park suddenly wanted to see. This is the Streisand effect in action, and South Park is arguably its greatest beneficiary. The show has been made more famous, more culturally relevant, and more commercially valuable by the efforts of people trying to destroy it. Every boycott is an advertisement. Every ban is a dare. Every outrage press release is a recommendation for people who want to see what all the fuss is about. It helps that the show has also been genuinely good throughout its run. This might sound obvious, but it matters. A show that was merely offensive without being smart or funny would have burned out years ago. Shock value has a very limited shelf life. What keeps people watching South Park isn't the controversy, it's the writing. Parker and Stone are genuinely talented satirists who have an incredible ability to identify the absurdity in any situation and distill it into 22 minutes of animated comedy. The controversies bring people in. The quality keeps them there. The 1-week production cycle is another factor that's kept the show alive. Because episodes are written and produced in just 6 days, South Park is almost always topical. It can respond to news events faster than any other scripted show on television. That immediacy makes it essential viewing in a way that other animated shows can't match. When something big happens in the world, people want to see what South Park will do with it. That anticipation drives consistent viewership regardless of whether any particular episode is controversial. There's also the matter of Parker and Stone's own approach to controversy. They don't apologize. They don't retract. They don't do damage control. When people get upset, Parker and Stone's response is almost always to make another joke. This strategy works because it denies their opponents the satisfaction of a concession. There's nothing for the outrage machine to grab onto. No tearful apology, no public reckoning, no promise to do better. Just 2 guys shrugging and moving on to the next episode. It's infuriating for their critics, but it's incredibly effective as a survival strategy. Compare this to how other shows and creators have handled controversy in recent years. Roseanne Barr sent one racist tweet and her show was canceled within hours. Shane Gillis was fired from Saturday Night Live before his first episode even aired because of old podcast clips. In each of these cases, the creator or performer was vulnerable because they were seen as having stepped outside the boundaries of what was acceptable. They were expected to be within certain limits, and when they crossed those limits, the consequences were swift. Parker and Stone have never been within any limits. They set up their position outside the boundaries from day one, and they've never pretended otherwise. You can't accuse them of crossing a line when they've spent their entire career demonstrating that they don't believe in lines. The expectations for South Park are so different from the expectations for any other show that the normal rules of controversy simply don't apply. And honestly, I think there's something deeper going on too. I think there's a genuine cultural value that a lot of people see in having a show like South Park on the air. Even people who don't watch the show, even people who find it offensive, recognize on some level that a society where South Park can exist is a healthier society than one where it can't. The show functions as a kind of canary in the coal mine for free expression. If South Park is still on the air, still saying whatever it wants, still making everyone uncomfortable, then the system is working. Free speech is intact. The moment South Park gets canceled, not because of low ratings, but because someone decided it was too offensive to continue, that's a signal that something has fundamentally changed about what we're allowed to say and think. I'm not saying everyone sees it that way, and I'm not saying the show is beyond criticism. It absolutely isn't. There are legitimate arguments that some of their content has been harmful, that the equal opportunity offense model can sometimes be a cover for genuinely hurtful material, and that the show's influence on how people think about political correctness and social sensitivity has not always been positive. Those are real conversations worth having. But the fact remains that South Park has survived for nearly 3 decades in an environment that has killed countless other shows for far less. And the reasons for that survival, the financial leverage, the equal opportunity model, the Streisand effect, the sheer quality of the writing, the refusal to apologize, all of these factors have combined to create something that seems genuinely uncancelable. Which, when you think about it, is exactly what Parker and Stone have been going for since the very beginning. They said it themselves in the very first episode of the show. Chef tells the boys, there's a time and a place for everything, and it's called college. For Parker and Stone, college was where it started, but the attitude they brought from those early days at the University of Colorado, that fearless, anti-authoritarian, nothing is sacred energy, is the same attitude that has kept them going ever since. They're still those 2 guys making crude animated shorts in a dorm room. They just happen to have a $900 million deal and 3 decades of cultural impact behind them now. But the show's survival hasn't come without cost. The Muhammad episodes are still banned. Isaac Hayes is gone. Parker and Stone have lived with security concerns that most television creators will never have to think about. They've been investigated by the Church of Scientology, condemned by the Catholic Church, banned by the Chinese government, and threatened with death by radical extremists. The price of being uncancelable is that you accumulate a lot of very powerful enemies. And while the show itself has survived, the scars from those battles are real and permanent. Speaking of battles, though, there are still a handful of episodes we haven't talked about yet. The ones that didn't generate the biggest headlines but were still quietly controversial in ways that deserve attention. Episodes that touched nerves so specific and so personal that the reactions were different from the big institutional blow-ups. Let me tell you about some of those. Not every South Park controversy came with press releases and police protection. Some of the show's most interesting moments were episodes that caused a different kind of discomfort. Not the kind that leads to boycotts, but the kind that makes people genuinely think. The kind where the controversy isn't external, it's internal. Where the audience itself is divided, where the message is ambiguous enough that reasonable people can walk away with completely different interpretations. Those episodes, to me, are often more interesting than the headline-grabbing ones. Let me start with one that almost nobody remembers was controversial at the time, but that has become more significant with every passing year. The Season 5 premiere, Scott Tenorman Must Die, aired in July of 2001. It's widely considered one of the greatest episodes in the show's history. And it's the episode that fundamentally changed how people understood Eric Cartman as a character. Before Scott Tenorman Must Die, Cartman was a brat. He was selfish, he was rude, he was racist, but he was basically a mean kid who occasionally got his comeuppance. In this episode, Cartman is tricked by an older kid named Scott Tenorman into buying his pubic hair for $16.50, thinking it will make him cool. When Cartman realizes he's been duped, he devises a scheme to get his money back. a scheme that escalates far, far beyond what anyone expects. The plan involves manipulating events so that Scott Tenorman's parents are shot by a local farmer, then having their bodies ground up into chili and served to Scott at a town chili cook-off. Scott eats the chili, Cartman reveals what it is, and then licks the tears off Scott's face while the boy screams in horror. Radiohead, Scott's favorite band, shows up on cue and calls him a crybaby. It's one of the darkest things the show has ever done. And the controversy, such as it was, wasn't about parents complaining or organizations protesting. It was about the audience itself grappling with the fact that one of the main characters on a comedy show had just committed what was essentially a double homicide and then cannibalized the victims by tricking their son into eating them. And the episode treats it as a victory. Cartman wins. He's triumphant. There's no moral lesson, no punishment, no consequence. Just pure sociopathic revenge played for laughs. The episode transformed Cartman from a nuisance into one of the most compelling villains in television history. But it also raised questions about what the show was celebrating. Were we supposed to be laughing at this? Were we supposed to be horrified? Both? The ambiguity was the point, and it's what makes the episode so effective. But it was also the moment where a lot of viewers realized that South Park was capable of going to places that were genuinely disturbing, not just crude or offensive. Moving on to something that hit much closer to real-world pain. In October of 2001, just 3 weeks after the September 11th attacks, South Park aired Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants. 3 weeks. The wounds were still fresh, the country was still in shock, and South Park aired an episode that depicted Osama bin Laden in a series of Looney Tunes-style slapstick sequences where he was humiliated and mocked. The response was deeply divided. Some people thought it was exactly what the country needed. A cathartic, irreverent takedown of the man who had just orchestrated the worst terrorist attack in American history. Humor as a defense mechanism, laughter as a form of defiance. Others thought it was grotesquely insensitive, that it trivialized a tragedy that had killed thousands of people and that was still being processed by a grieving nation. Parker and Stone have spoken about the decision to air that episode, and they've said they believe that humor was one of the most important tools people had for processing trauma. They felt that treating bin Laden as a figure worthy of fear and reverence was giving him exactly what he wanted, and that the most American response was to turn him into a joke. Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, you have to acknowledge that it took a particular kind of courage to make that choice when they did. 3 weeks out from the worst day in modern American history, and they chose laughter. Then there were the school shooting episodes. South Park has addressed gun violence in schools multiple times, and each time the reaction has been complicated and raw. In the very first season, Weight Gain 4000 featured Cartman going on a shooting rampage at the school assembly. Though the tone was still fairly cartoonish and the episode was more about Cartman's weight and ego than about gun violence specifically. But the show returned to the topic more seriously as school shootings became an increasingly prominent part of American life. In episodes like Butt Out and Dead Kids, the show tackled the issue from different angles. Dead Kids from season 22 in 2018 was particularly effective and particularly uncomfortable. The episode depicted school shootings as something so routine that the adults in South Park treated them as a normal, if annoying, part of daily life. Stan comes home from school and casually mentions that there was another shooting, and Sharon, his mother, is the only person in town who thinks this should be a big deal. Everyone else shrugs it off. The satire was cutting because it was barely exaggerating reality. By 2018, school shootings had become so frequent in the United States that each new incident seemed to generate less and less shock. The national conversation had become repetitive, almost scripted. Thoughts and prayers, calls for gun control, arguments about mental health, nothing changing, and then the next shooting. South Park's decision to depict this numbness, this acceptance of the unacceptable, was controversial precisely because it held up a mirror that a lot of people didn't want to look into. Another quietly controversial territory was the show's handling of climate change, which is actually one of the few areas where Parker and Stone have publicly admitted they got it wrong. In 2006, the 10th season featured a 2-part episode called Man Bear Pig. in which Al Gore is depicted as a deluded, attention-seeking lunatic who is obsessed with a fictional creature called Man-Bear Pig that he insists is real but that nobody else can see. The metaphor was obvious. Man-Bear Pig was climate change, and Al Gore was the annoying alarmist that Parker and Stone believed was exaggerating the threat. The episode was celebrated by climate skeptics and condemned by environmentalists. It was one of the most politically pointed things South Park had ever done, because unlike their usual approach, which attacked all sides of an issue, this felt like a pretty clear statement of position. They were mocking Al Gore and, by extension, people who were sounding the alarm about global warming. But here's where it gets interesting. 12 years later, in 2018, South Park revisited Man-Bear Pig. In a pair of season 22 episodes, Man-Bear Pig returns, and this time he's very real. And he's destroying everything. The townspeople of South Park have to confront the fact that the creature they dismissed and ignored for years has become a genuine existential threat. Al Gore returns, not as a deluded fool, but as the guy who was right all along. And the town has to negotiate with Man-Bear Pig, making increasingly desperate deals to survive the consequences of their own denial. It was as close to a public apology as South Park has ever come. Parker and Stone essentially said through the show that they had been wrong about climate change. They had dismissed it as alarmism, and the evidence had proven them wrong. The episodes were praised by many critics as a surprisingly mature and honest act of self-correction. Here was a show famous for never backing down, for never admitting fault, for never apologizing, and they were admitting they'd gotten one of the biggest issues of the century wrong. Some people found the correction insufficient. They pointed out that the original Man-Bear Pig episodes had contributed to climate skepticism at a critical moment, and that a retraction 12 years later couldn't undo that damage. Others argued that the willingness to admit error was itself admirable and rare. Wherever you fall on that debate, the Man-Bear Pig arc is one of the most fascinating things South Park has ever done, because it showed that Parker and Stone are capable of growth and self-reflection even on issues where they'd previously been firmly entrenched. Then there were the Trump seasons. Seasons 19 through 21, covering roughly 2015 through 2017, saw South Park take on the rise of Donald Trump and the cultural upheaval that accompanied it. They introduced Mr. Garrison as a Trump stand-in, eventually having him become president in a storyline that mirrored real events in ways that were sometimes uncomfortably close to reality. But here's where things went sideways. Parker and Stone later admitted that they had fully expected Hillary Clinton to win the 2016 election. They had written and produced an episode called The Very First Gentleman that assumed a Clinton victory. When Trump actually won, they had to scramble to rewrite and produce a completely different episode in less than 24 hours. The replacement episode, Oh Geez, aired the night after the election and dealt with the shock and confusion of the result. The Trump-era episodes were some of the most divisive in the show's history, but not because of any single shocking moment. The controversy was more diffuse. Conservative fans felt the show was being too hard on Trump. Liberal fans felt it wasn't being hard enough. Some critics argued that South Park's both sides are ridiculous approach was fundamentally inadequate for dealing with a political situation that many people felt was genuinely dangerous. The show's trademark nihilism, its refusal to take any position seriously, felt to some viewers like a luxury that the political moment couldn't afford. Parker himself acknowledged some of this in interviews, suggesting that the Trump era had made it harder for the show to operate in its usual mode. When reality itself becomes absurd, it's harder for satire to find a target. When the actual news is more outrageous than anything a cartoon can come up with, the cartoonists lose their edge. South Park didn't handle the Trump era badly exactly, but it struggled more visibly than it had with any previous political moment. There were also the episodes dealing with transgender issues, which became increasingly controversial as the cultural conversation around gender identity intensified. The Sissy from season 18 in 2014 featured Cartman claiming to be transgender, so he could use the girls' bathroom, while a separate storyline dealt more sympathetically with Randy Marsh's alter ego Lord, ultimately landing on a message about acceptance and identity. Bored Girls from season 23 in 2019 was more provocative. It featured a character called Heather Swanson, who is essentially a parody of debates about transgender athletes in women's sports. The character is a muscular, hyper-masculine figure who transitions and then dominates women's competitions. The episode was praised by some as a sharp commentary on a genuine policy debate, and condemned by others as transphobic and harmful. These gender-related episodes became flashpoints in a larger cultural war that South Park found itself pulled into whether it wanted to be or not. The show's instinct to mock all positions equally was harder to apply here because the stakes for transgender people were perceived as being different from the stakes of, say, a celebrity feud or a political disagreement. When the subject of your satire is a vulnerable minority group, the equal opportunity offense defense becomes more complicated, and both fans and critics of the show knew it. I also want to mention the two-part episode, Do the Handicapped Go to Hell, and Probably from Season 4. These episodes dealt directly with Catholic theology, specifically the question of whether disabled people and people of other faiths are condemned to hell according to strict Catholic doctrine. The episodes featured an extended sequence set in hell, complete with Satan and Saddam Hussein as a bickering couple, and the boys of South Park trying to figure out how to avoid eternal damnation. These episodes drew complaints from Catholic groups, but they're interesting because the criticism came from both directions. Some Catholics were offended by the depiction of hell and the mockery of their theology, but others acknowledged that the episodes were raising legitimate questions about the logical implications of certain religious doctrines. If you take the doctrine of exclusive salvation seriously, then yes, the vast majority of humanity is going to hell, including disabled people, people of other faiths, and pretty much everyone who isn't a practicing Catholic. The episode simply followed that logic to its conclusion and asked whether anyone was really comfortable with where it led. There are dozens more episodes I could talk about. Bloody Mary aside, there was Red Hot Catholic Love, which dealt with the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. There was All About Mormons, which gave a surprisingly balanced and detailed account of the founding of Mormonism, while simultaneously questioning the plausibility of its foundational stories. There was Goobacks, which addressed illegal immigration by having people from the future travel back in time to take jobs, leading to the iconic phrase, "They took our jobs," which became a cultural meme that transcended the show entirely. Each of these episodes generated its own specific controversy, its own specific set of complaints and defenses, its own specific cultural moment. And each one added another layer to South Park's reputation as a show that would go anywhere, say anything, and let the audience sort out the meaning for themselves. What strikes me about all of these quieter controversies is that they reveal something important about how South Park actually functions as a piece of art. The big controversies, the Scientology war, the death threats, the China ban, those are dramatic stories about powerful institutions versus fearless creators. They make great narratives. But the quieter controversies, the ones about race and disability and climate change and gender, those are the ones that actually challenge the audience. Those are the ones that make you sit with your own discomfort and figure out where you stand. And I think that's ultimately what South Park is best at. Not provoking institutions, though it does that very well, but provoking individuals, making each viewer in each episode confront something they'd rather not think about. Whether it's the absurdity of their own religious beliefs, the hypocrisy of their political positions, the arbitrary nature of their social taboos, or the uncomfortable truth that the things they find offensive are often the things that most need to be said. That's a rare quality in any form of entertainment, and it's what has kept South Park relevant and vital for nearly 3 decades. Not the crude humor, not the celebrity mockery, not the shock value. Those are just the delivery mechanism. The real substance of the show is its relentless, exhausting, sometimes infuriating insistence on holding up a mirror and refusing to let anyone look away. Which brings us, I think, to a good place to start wrapping things up. Because we've covered a lot of ground tonight, we've gone from construction paper shorts in a Boulder dorm room to $900 million deals, from school dress code violations to international diplomatic incidents, from crude jokes about bodily functions to one of the most important free speech debates in modern history. And I want to take a few minutes to try to make sense of all of it. to step back and ask what South Park's legacy actually is after all these years and all these fights. Before I wrap things up, I want to spend a little more time with some episodes and stories that we haven't fully explored yet. Because one of the things about doing a deep dive into South Park is that there's always more, always another controversy, another behind-the-scenes drama, another moment where the show pushed a boundary that nobody even knew existed. So let me take you through a few more of these because they're too good to leave out. Let's talk about It Hits the Fan from Season 5, which aired in June of 2001. This is the one where the word shit was said on television, uncensored, 162 times in a single 22-minute episode. The premise was simple and brilliant. A fictional cop show on television decides to use the word shit for the first time, and it becomes a massive cultural event. Everyone in America tunes in to hear a network television show say the forbidden word. After it airs, the floodgates open. Suddenly, everyone is saying it constantly in every context with complete abandon. The word loses all meaning and power through sheer overuse. The episode was a direct response to a real event. In 1999, the CBS show Chicago Hope became the first network drama to use the word shit uncensored, and it generated an enormous amount of media attention. Parker and Stone thought the whole spectacle was absurd. A single word said once on one show and the entire country lost its mind. So they decided to say it 162 times and see what happened. What happened was fascinating. The Parents Television Council predictably was outraged, but the critical response was largely positive. Many reviewers understood that the episode was actually making a sophisticated argument about language, taboo, and the arbitrary nature of what society considers offensive. By saying the word so many times that it became meaningless, the episode was demonstrating that words only have the power we give them. The offense comes not from the word itself, but from the social agreement that the word is offensive. Remove that agreement, and it's just a sound. Comedy Central, to their credit, let the episode air without any censorship. It was a calculated risk that paid off. The episode became a cultural event in its own right, just like the fictional cop show in the storyline. Entertainment Weekly featured it. News programs discussed it. And at the end of the day, nobody was actually harmed by hearing a word said 162 times, which was, of course, exactly the point. Now, let me take you somewhere completely different. Woodland Critter Christmas from Season 8, which aired in December of 2004. This is one of those episodes that starts off seeming like one thing and gradually reveals itself to be something entirely different and much, much darker. The episode begins as a Christmas special narrated in a warm, rhyming storybook style. Stan meets a group of adorable woodland critters who are celebrating Christmas. There's a bear, a rabbit, a squirrel, a fox, and several others, all drawn in a deliberately cute children's book style. They ask Stan for help building a manger for a star that's about to give birth. It seems like the sweetest, most innocent thing South Park has ever done. Then the show pulls the rug out. It turns out the woodland critters are Satanists. The star they're waiting for is pregnant with the Antichrist. Their cute, cuddly exteriors hide the most depraved, violent, and sexually explicit behavior imaginable. The contrast between the saccharine narration style and the absolutely horrific content is what makes the episode work. It's a parody of Christmas specials, of children's programming, and of the entire concept of holiday sentimentality. And it's one of the most genuinely shocking episodes the show has ever produced, not because of any political statement, but because of the sheer audacity of the tonal whiplash. The episode didn't generate any major institutional controversy, but it became one of the most talked about South Park episodes among fans. It's frequently cited as one of the darkest things ever to air on television, animated or otherwise. And it's a perfect example of how the show sometimes generates controversy, not through political provocation, but through pure creative extremism. Parker and Stone didn't need to offend a religion or a political group with this one. They just needed to take the wholesome Christmas special format and twist it into something nightmarish. Let me also talk about Fish Sticks from Season 13, because it's one of the funniest celebrity takedowns in the show's history, and it generated its own very public real-world drama. The episode is about a joke. A simple joke. Jimmy Valmer comes up with it. Do you like fish sticks? Yes. Do you like putting fish sticks in your mouth? Yes. What are you, a gay fish? It's a terrible joke. A classic playground-level pun that confuses fish sticks with fish dicks. And the whole joke of the episode is that this terrible joke becomes the biggest thing in comedy. Everyone in the world thinks it's hilarious. Carlos Mencia steals it, claiming he wrote it. Cartman convinces himself he was the co-writer. And Kanye West doesn't get it. That's the running gag. Kanye, depicted as someone so ego-driven and so lacking in self-awareness that he literally cannot process the idea of himself as the butt of a joke, spends the entire episode trying to understand why everyone keeps calling him a gay fish. He consults advisors. He analyzes the joke structure. He considers every possible interpretation, and he simply cannot grasp the punchline. The episode ends with Kanye accepting his identity as a gay fish and swimming into the ocean to be with his own kind. What made this episode remarkable was the real-world response from Kanye himself. In the days after the episode aired, Kanye posted on his blog about it. His response went through several stages, from anger to confusion to something approaching grudging respect. He talked about how his ego was his biggest asset and his biggest enemy, and how the episode had forced him to confront his own tendency toward grandiosity. It was a surprisingly self-aware reaction from someone whose lack of self-awareness was the entire premise of the joke. The gay fish joke became a permanent part of pop culture. Years later, people were still referencing it. Kanye himself acknowledged it multiple times in interviews and even seemed to lean into the joke on occasion. It's a case where South Park's satire actually seemed to affect its target in a constructive way, which is honestly pretty rare. Most of the time, the people they mock just get angry. Kanye's response, while initially hostile, eventually became something more interesting and more human. I want to circle back to something about the show's production process, because it's genuinely relevant to understanding how these controversies play out. As I mentioned earlier, South Park episodes are written, animated, and produced in 6 days, 1 week from blank page to broadcast. This isn't just a fun fact about the show. It fundamentally shapes the kind of controversies they create. Because here's what that means in practice. When Parker and Stone decide to tackle a topic, they're working with whatever is in the news that week. They're reacting in real time. They don't have months to think through every possible objection and soften every potentially offensive edge. They don't have a team of lawyers reviewing every joke for legal liability. They don't have focus groups testing the material for audience sensitivity. They write it, they animate it, and they air it. If it pisses someone off, they deal with it next week. That process creates a rawness that is both the show's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The rawness is what makes the satire feel urgent and honest. But it also means that sometimes they miss. Sometimes they go too far or not far enough. Sometimes the target is wrong, or the angle is off, or the joke doesn't land the way they intended. The man-bear-pig situation, where they later admitted they were wrong about climate change, is the clearest example. They made those episodes in the heat of the moment, reacting to the Al Gore publicity tour and the general liberal hand-wringing that they found annoying, and they didn't fully grapple with the underlying science until years later. This production style also means that the show's controversies are often driven by impulse rather than strategy. Parker and Stone aren't sitting down and calculating which targets will generate the most attention. They're going with whatever strikes them as funny or absurd in any given week. The Scientology episode happened because they finally got around to a topic they'd been thinking about for years. The Muhammad episodes happened because the Danish cartoons controversy was in the news. The China episode happened because the NBA was bending the knee to Beijing. There's no master plan. There's just 2 guys with a whiteboard, a deadline, and a stubborn refusal to say no to any idea. Let me share a few more quick stories that deserve to be part of this conversation. In 2005, the show aired Trapped in the Closet, which we've already talked about at length. But what I didn't mention was that the same season also included Bloody Mary, the death of Eric Cartman and Ginger Kids. That last one, Ginger Kids, is the episode where Cartman launches a hate campaign against kids with red hair and freckles, comparing them to vampires and arguing that they have no souls. The episode was intended as a satire of prejudice and discrimination. The entire point was that Cartman's hatred of gingers was irrational and absurd, and that bigotry of any kind is ultimately stupid. But something unexpected happened. A Kick a Ginger Day event began spreading on Facebook and in schools, inspired by the episode. Kids with red hair were being bullied and physically harassed. A 14-year-old in British Columbia posted a Facebook event encouraging people to kick gingers, and it went viral. Schools had to intervene. Parents complained. Parker and Stone were horrified. The episode was meant to mock bigotry, not inspire it. They responded by making a follow-up episode where Cartman, who wakes up one morning to discover he's become a ginger, immediately reverses his position and starts arguing for ginger rights. The point was even more explicit this time. Hatred is stupid. Empathy is what happens when you walk in someone else's shoes. And people who hate based on arbitrary characteristics are morons. But the damage from the misinterpretation of the original episode had already been done. It was one of the few times where South Park's satire backfired in a way that directly caused harm to real people. Then there was Britney's New Look from season 12 in 2008. The episode aired during the period when Britney Spears was going through a very public mental health crisis, including a head-shaving incident, involuntary psychiatric holds, and a custody battle for her children. The media coverage of Spears during this time was relentless and often cruel. South Park's take on it was interesting because it was simultaneously part of the problem and a commentary on it. The episode depicted Britney attempting suicide and surviving with half her head blown off, then being forced by the media and public to continue performing. The townspeople of South Park are revealed to be participating in a Shirley Jackson-style ritualistic sacrifice, where they select a celebrity each year to destroy through media attention. The metaphor was clear. The entertainment industry and the public that consumes it are complicit in the destruction of the celebrities they obsess over. We build them up so we can tear them down. It's a blood sacrifice dressed up as entertainment news. The episode generated complaints from people who felt it was exploiting Spears' real suffering for comedic purposes. But it was also praised by critics who recognized that the episode was actually defending Spears, or at least indicting the system that was destroying her. It's one of those South Park episodes where the controversy itself proves the point. People were offended by a cartoon depicting the media's cruelty toward Britney Spears, while simultaneously consuming media coverage that was being genuinely cruel toward Britney Spears. The hypocrisy was baked into the reaction. I also want to mention the show's long and complicated relationship with the LGBTQ community. South Park was one of the first animated shows to feature openly gay characters as part of its regular cast. Mr. Garrison, Big Gay Al, and Mr. Slave are all characters who have been on the show for years, sometimes decades. And the show's treatment of these characters has been wildly uneven. Sometimes the representation has been surprisingly progressive. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride from the very first season was remarkably sympathetic for 1997. The episode ends with Big Gay Al accepting himself and the boys of South Park learning that being gay is normal and nothing to be afraid of. Given that this aired in the late 90s, when most television was still deeply uncomfortable with gay characters, it was genuinely ahead of its time. But other episodes have been much more controversial. Mr. Garrison's storyline has included a sex change operation depicted in graphic detail, a subsequent detransition, and a long period where the character was used primarily as a vehicle for jokes about transgender identity that many people found demeaning. The show has sometimes been praised for normalizing LGBTQ characters by treating them with the same irreverence as everyone else, and sometimes criticized for using queer characters primarily as punchlines. This tension reflects one of the fundamental contradictions at the heart of South Park's project. Equal opportunity offense sounds great in theory, but in practice, not all groups are equally situated. Making fun of a powerful institution like Scientology is different from making fun of a marginalized group like transgender people. The joke lands differently. The stakes are different. The potential for real-world harm is different. And yet, South Park insists on treating all targets the same, which creates a permanent source of controversy that will probably never be resolved as long as the show exists. There's one more story I want to tell before we move toward the close, and it's about the movie. Not the 1999 movie, which we've already covered, but about a moment from the Academy Awards that year that perfectly encapsulates the South Park phenomenon. When Blame Canada was nominated for Best Original Song, Parker and Stone were invited to the Oscar ceremony. They've told the story many times, and the details vary slightly depending on the telling, but the core of it is consistent. They decided to wear dresses to the event. Not subtle, modest dresses, full-on glamorous gowns of the kind that would normally be worn by the biggest female movie stars in the world. Parker and Stone showed up to the most prestigious event in the entertainment industry dressed in women's evening wear, reportedly under the influence of psychedelic substances. The Academy had hired Robin Williams to perform Blame Canada during the ceremony, which was itself a surreal moment. One of the most famous comedians in the world performing a song about blaming an entire country for corrupting America's children at an awards show broadcast to hundreds of billions of people worldwide. Williams, to his credit, committed fully and gave a great performance. But the nominated song lost to Phil Collins's You'll Be in My Heart from Tarzan. Parker later said he was genuinely annoyed about losing, not because he cared about the Oscar itself, but because he felt Blame Canada was a better song, and that the Academy had been afraid to give an animated comedy about foul-mouthed children one of their most prestigious awards. The whole experience, the dresses, the drugs, the nomination, the loss, the spectacle of it all, was quintessential Parker and Stone. They took the most serious, most self-important event in the entertainment industry and turned it into a joke. And the industry, despite itself, played along. That Oscar night story is actually a perfect metaphor for everything we've been talking about tonight. Parker and Stone have spent their entire career showing up to serious places, wearing metaphorical dresses, and daring people to take offense. Sometimes people do. Sometimes the consequences are severe, but they keep showing up. They keep wearing the dresses, and somehow, against all odds and all expectations, they keep getting invited back. I want to spend some time talking about how the show itself evolved over the years, because the South Park of 2025 is a very different beast from the South Park of 1997, and that evolution has a lot to do with why the controversies change in nature and intensity over time. In the early seasons, the show was primarily a shock comedy. The jokes were crude, the plots were simple, and the controversy was mostly about language and content. Parents were upset because their kids were repeating Cartman's catchphrases. Teachers were worried about South Park t-shirts. The PTA was concerned about anal probes. It was surface level offense, and the institutional response was surface level too. A few boycotts, a few letters, some hand-wringing on the evening news, and then everyone moved on. But around season 4 or 5, something shifted. The show started getting smarter. The satire got sharper. The targets got bigger. Instead of just being vulgar for vulgarity's sake, the episodes began to have genuine thesis statements about politics, religion, media, and culture. The vulgarity was still there, of course. It's South Park, but it was in service of something larger. And that shift is what turned South Park from a cultural curiosity into a cultural force. A big part of that evolution was the production transition from actual stop-motion construction paper to computer animation. The original pilot was animated by hand using real construction paper cutouts moved frame by frame. It took months to produce a single episode, but by the second season, the show had moved to computer-generated animation using software that replicated the cut paper look digitally. This allowed them to produce episodes much faster, which eventually led to the famous 6-day production cycle. That production speed wasn't just a logistical convenience. It fundamentally changed the kind of show South Park could be. When you can write and produce an episode in less than a week, you can respond to current events in real time. The Wednesday night before an episode airs, Parker and Stone might still be working on the script. If something major happens in the news on Monday, it can be in the episode by Wednesday. That immediacy gave South Park a relevance that no other animated show could match. And it also meant that their controversies felt more urgent and more connected to the cultural moment. The documentary 6 Days to Air, released in 2011, gave viewers a behind-the-scenes look at this process and revealed just how chaotic and pressured it really is. The film follows the production of the season 15 premiere over its 6-day cycle, and what it shows is frankly terrifying. Parker barely sleeps. Animators are working through the night. Scripts are being rewritten hours before airtime. Jokes are being recorded and animated simultaneously. The whole thing looks like a controlled disaster held together by caffeine and Parker's singular creative vision. Parker has acknowledged in interviews that this process takes an enormous personal toll. He's described feeling physically ill with anxiety before every single episode, despite having done it hundreds of times. The fear that the episode won't be good enough, that the joke won't land, that they'll miss the moment, that pressure never goes away. And it's that pressure, that constant edge, that keeps the show sharp. Comfort is the enemy of good satire, and Parker and Stone have never been comfortable. Let me also talk about the South Park specials that came after the big Paramount deal. Starting in 2021, Parker and Stone began producing longer-form movies for Paramount Plus, which were essentially extended episodes running an hour or more. The first of these, South Park Vaccination Special, dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic and the conspiracy theories surrounding it. The special depicted the townspeople of South Park navigating vaccine distribution, QAnon-style conspiracy theories, and the general chaos of pandemic-era America. The COVID specials were controversial for reasons that were different from the show's usual controversies. The pandemic was still ongoing. People were dying. The debate over vaccines was emotionally charged and politically polarized. South Park waded into this with its usual irreverence, mocking both the anti-vaxxers and the smug certainty of the pro-vaccine crowd. The show's both sides approach felt more uncomfortable than usual because the stakes were literally life and death. When you're satirizing a political debate, the consequences of the satire are relatively abstract. When you're satirizing a public health crisis, the consequences can be very concrete. The specials also introduced a time jump concept that aged the boys up to adults, which generated its own form of controversy among longtime fans who felt that the adult versions of the characters lacked the charm and dynamism of the kid versions. Parker and Stone have gone back and forth on this concept, sometimes using the adult timeline and sometimes returning to the classic format. And the debate among fans about which version is better has become its own mini controversy. There's something else I want to address, and it's something that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. South Park has never had a woman in a primary creative role. Parker writes and directs most episodes. Stone produces and co-writes. The writer's room has historically been small and male-dominated. Ann Garifino, who has been an executive producer on the show from the beginning, is the most prominent woman associated with the production, and by all accounts she's been enormously influential behind the scenes. But the voice of the show, the creative vision, has always been Parker's and Stone's. This matters because a lot of the show's controversies have revolved around its treatment of women, gender, and sexuality. Episodes like Stupid Spoiled Whore Video Playset, which satirized the influence of Paris Hilton on young girls, were praised by some feminists and criticized by others. The show's depiction of female characters has been inconsistent, ranging from sharp feminist commentary to crude stereotyping, sometimes within the same episode. Whether the lack of female creative voices at the top of the production hierarchy has influenced these inconsistencies is a legitimate question that doesn't have a simple answer. I should also mention the video games, because they've been their own source of controversy. South Park: The Stick of Truth was released in 2014, and it included an extended sequence where the player character is abducted by aliens and anally probed. In certain markets, including Australia and parts of Europe, this sequence was censored and replaced with a still image of a crying koala bear with text explaining what was being censored. It was a characteristically South Park response to censorship, mocking the act of censorship within the censorship itself. South Park: The Fractured But Whole followed in 2017 and featured a difficulty slider that was explicitly tied to the player character's skin color. Making your character darker skinned increased the difficulty. Parker and Stone described this as a commentary on systemic racism. Critics were divided on whether this was a clever satire of how race affects real-life outcomes or a tasteless gimmick. The fact that the difficulty adjustment only affected the amount of money you earned in the game and not the actual combat difficulty was seen by some as undermining the satire and by others as the joke itself. Let me bring up one more thing, which is the show's relationship with its own legacy. In 2020, as part of the Paramount Plus deal, a number of South Park episodes were pulled from the HBO Max streaming platform and moved exclusively to Paramount Plus. But 5 episodes remained unavailable on any platform. Those 5, as we've discussed, are Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Parts 1 and 2, and 200 and 201. All 5 involve depictions or discussions of Muhammad. The continued unavailability of these episodes has become a point of frustration for fans and a point of principle for free speech advocates. Every year, someone writes an article about it. Every year, fans petition for the episodes to be released. And every year, the answer is the same. No, the episodes remain banned not by any government, but by the corporate entities that own them. It's a voluntary suppression driven by fear of the kind of violence that was threatened in 2010. Parker and Stone have been largely silent on the subject of the banned episodes in recent years. They don't bring it up in interviews. They don't reference it on the show. Whether that silence represents acceptance, frustration, or a strategic decision to stop drawing attention to a situation they can't change is unclear. But the banned episodes loom over the show's legacy like a shadow. They're the proof that even South Park, the show that goes everywhere and says everything, has limits. Not limits that Parker and Stone chose, but limits that were imposed on them by forces they couldn't defeat. It's tempting to see the banned episodes as a failure, as evidence that the system won, that intimidation worked, that free expression lost. And in a narrow sense, that's true. Those specific episodes are suppressed, and they're likely to remain suppressed for the foreseeable future. But I think the broader picture is more complicated and ultimately more hopeful. Because the existence of those banned episodes and the public's knowledge that they exist and the ongoing conversation about why they're banned, all of that is itself a form of free expression. The censorship has become part of the story, and the story, unlike the episodes themselves, cannot be banned. Every time someone talks about the Muhammad episodes, every time a journalist writes about them, every time a fan discusses them online, the ideas in those episodes are being transmitted. Not through the episodes themselves, but through the conversation about them. Parker and Stone may not have planned it that way. They certainly would have preferred their episodes to air uncensored and be available on every platform. But the outcome, whether intended or not, is that the censorship has amplified their message rather than suppressing it. Just like the Streisand effect that they've benefited from so many times before, the banning of these episodes has made them more famous, more discussed, and more culturally significant than they would have been if they'd just aired normally and been forgotten. And that, I think, is the most South Park thing of all. Even when they lose, they win. Even when they're silenced, their voice gets louder. Even when the system beats them, the story of the beating becomes more powerful than whatever the system was trying to protect. It's the same dynamic that has played out in every single controversy we've discussed tonight. Scientology tried to suppress Trapped in the Closet and turned it into one of the most celebrated episodes in television history. The Catholic League tried to bury Bloody Mary and created an international news story that sextupled the episode's audience. China tried to erase South Park from their internet and gave Parker and Stone the opportunity to write one of the most viral statements in modern pop culture. Every time someone tries to shut them up, they get louder. That's the South Park paradox, and it's been operating for almost 30 years without interruption. There's one more dimension to all of this that I haven't fully explored, and I think it's worth spending some time on before we head toward the close. It's the relationship between South Park and the broader animation industry, because the show didn't just change television. It changed how people thought about what animation could be and who it was for. Before South Park, adult animation was basically The Simpsons and whatever else Fox was trying. Beavis and Butthead had proven there was an appetite for crude animated humor on MTV, and King of the Hill was doing something interesting with animated realism. But the idea that animation could be a vehicle for genuinely dangerous satire, the kind that provoked international incidents and death threats, that was new. Animation was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be for kids, or at most for families. Even The Simpsons, for all its brilliance, operated within a fairly comfortable zone of social commentary. Homer might strangle Bart, but nobody was going to die. Nobody was going to eat their parents in a bowl of chili. South Park shattered that expectation completely, and the ripple effects are still being felt. When Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy in 1999, he was explicitly building on the template that South Park had established. The crude humor, the pop culture references, the willingness to offend. Family Guy took those elements and repackaged them in a more accessible, less politically pointed format. When Adult Swim launched on Cartoon Network in 2001, it was filling a demand for adult-oriented animation that South Park had proven existed. When shows like Rick and Morty and BoJack Horseman pushed the boundaries of what animated shows could say about depression, nihilism, and the human condition, they were walking through a door that South Park had kicked open. Even in the world of streaming, South Park's influence is everywhere. The fact that platforms like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon are willing to invest in animated content aimed at adults, content that deals with mature themes and uses language and imagery that would never appear in a children's show, is a direct consequence of South Park proving that there's a massive audience for that kind of material. The $900 million deal that Parker and Stone signed wasn't just a testament to their own value. It was a testament to the value of the entire adult animation category that they helped create. I also want to revisit something about Parker and Stone's personal lives, because the toll of decades of controversy is something that often gets overlooked in these kinds of retrospectives. These are real people. They have families, they have friends, they have lives outside of the show. And those lives have been directly affected by the controversies we've discussed. After the Muhammad episodes in 2010, Parker and Stone had to increase their personal security. They don't talk about the specifics publicly, which is understandable, but it's been reported that they took the threat seriously enough to make significant changes to how they live and work. Parker has also spoken about the mental health toll of the weekly production cycle. The anxiety, the sleep deprivation, the constant pressure to be funny and relevant and provocative, all of it adds up over time. Stone has been somewhat more philosophical about it in interviews. He's talked about how the show has given him and Parker an incredible platform to express themselves, but also how it's trapped them in a cycle that's difficult to escape. When you've been doing something for nearly 30 years, when your entire identity and livelihood is wrapped up in a single creative endeavor, stepping away from it becomes almost impossible even if you wanted to. They're contractually committed to the show through at least 26 seasons, and the Paramount Plus specials add even more obligations on top of that. Freedom and obligation exist side by side. There's an interview from around 2013 where Parker described the weekly production process as like running into a burning building every week. He said that the terror never goes away, that every Monday morning he sits down with a blank page and genuinely doesn't know if they'll have a finished episode by Wednesday. After 16 years at that point, after hundreds of episodes, the fear was still there. That vulnerability, that willingness to be terrified and do it anyway, is something I genuinely admire about both of them. Let me also mention something about the show's legacy in terms of political influence. Whether Parker and Stone intended it or not, South Park has had a measurable impact on how Americans, particularly younger Americans, think about politics and public discourse. The term South Park Republican was coined in the early 2000s to describe a particular political archetype. Socially liberal, fiscally conservative, distrustful of both major political parties, and deeply skeptical of anyone who takes themselves too seriously. It was a new category of political identity, one that didn't map neatly onto the traditional left-right spectrum, and it was directly influenced by the show's sensibility. Whether the South Park Republican is a positive or negative development in American politics depends entirely on your own political views. But the fact that a cartoon show created an identifiable political archetype is remarkable by any standard. It speaks to the show's reach and influence in ways that go far beyond entertainment. The show has also influenced how people think about political correctness, a topic that has become increasingly contentious in recent years. South Park has been one of the most consistent and visible critics of what it sees as excessive political correctness, and its influence on that debate is hard to overstate. The character of PC Principal, introduced in season 19, became a cultural shorthand for the kind of aggressive, performative political correctness that many people found irritating and counterproductive. The character was so effective as a satirical creation that he became part of the broader cultural conversation about free speech, campus politics, and the limits of social pressure. Again, whether this influence has been positive or negative is a matter of perspective. Some see South Park's anti-PC stance as a valuable defense of free expression and open debate. Others see it as providing cover for people who want to say hurtful things without consequences, and who use political correctness as a scapegoat for being called out on genuinely harmful behavior. The truth, as with most things involving South Park, probably contains elements of both. What I find most interesting about all of this is how the show's influence has evolved alongside the culture. In the late 90s and early 2000s, South Park's irreverence felt countercultural. It was pushing back against a mainstream that was still relatively conservative in its attitudes toward language, sexuality, and social norms. The show felt rebellious and subversive, like punk rock in animated form. But as the culture shifted, particularly after the rise of social media and the corresponding intensification of debates about identity, representation, and speech, South Park's position changed. It was no longer pushing back against a conservative mainstream. It was pushing back against a progressive mainstream, or at least against what it perceived as progressive overreach. The same anti-authoritarian instinct that had made the show feel radical in the 90s now sometimes made it feel reactionary in the 2010s and 2020s. Parker and Stone have navigated this shift with varying degrees of success. Some of their recent episodes have been as sharp and relevant as anything in the show's history. Others have felt out of step with a cultural moment that has moved beyond the kind of both sides irreverence that was once the show's signature. The challenge for any long-running satirical show is that the targets keep moving, and what felt like punching up 20 years ago can sometimes feel like punching down today. But here's what keeps me coming back to South Park even after all these years and all these controversies. The show cares. Underneath all the crude humor and the shock value and the deliberate provocation, there's a genuine engagement with the world. Parker and Stone aren't cynics, despite what their critics sometimes claim. They're idealists disguised as nihilists. They believe in free speech. They believe in honesty. They believe that the truth is usually funnier than any lie, and that the best way to deal with the absurdities of modern life is to laugh at them rather than surrender to them. And they believe in their audience. They've never talked down to the people who watch their show. They've never assumed that their viewers can't handle difficult material or complex ideas. They've always trusted that the audience will get the joke, will understand the satire, will see through the crude surface to the point underneath. That trust is rare in television, and it's one of the reasons why South Park has maintained such a loyal following for so long. The show's motto, to the extent that it has one, might be the line that Kyle delivers at the end of so many episodes. You know, I learned something today. It's usually played for laughs, a punchline that undercuts whatever lesson the episode has been building toward. But there's a sincerity underneath the irony. South Park does want you to learn something. It just wants you to learn it through laughter rather than through lectures. And in a media landscape increasingly dominated by people telling you what to think, there's something refreshing about a show that would rather make you think for yourself. And while we're on the subject of lessons, I want to mention one more thing that I think is important. Over the course of the show's run, Parker and Stone have occasionally broken from their usual mode and done episodes that are genuinely, unironically moving. These moments are rare, which is what makes them so effective. When a show that spends 99% of its time being crude and irreverent suddenly gets sincere, it hits harder than sincerity from a show that's earnest all the time. The best example might be the two-part episode, You're Getting Old and Asperger's from season 15. In these episodes, Stan turns 10 years old and suddenly starts seeing and hearing everything as, well, the show's word for feces. Music, movies, his friends' conversations, everything sounds and looks like garbage to him. It's a metaphor for growing up, for losing the ability to enjoy things the way you did as a kid, for the onset of cynicism and the creeping suspicion that maybe nothing is as good as it used to be. The first part ends with Stan's parents separating and Fleetwood Mac's Landslide playing over a montage of the family falling apart. It's one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the show's history. Fans weren't sure if it was a joke. Some thought the show was genuinely ending. The tone was so different from anything South Park had done before that people didn't know how to process it. Parker later confirmed that the episode was deeply personal. He was going through a difficult period in his own life, including a divorce, and the feelings Stan experiences in the episode were a direct reflection of what Parker himself was feeling. The sense that everything had lost its meaning, that the things that used to bring joy now felt hollow and stale. Those weren't just plot points. They were genuine emotions from a man who had been doing the same incredibly demanding job for over 15 years and was struggling with whether any of it still mattered. The second part, Asperger's, resolved things in a typically South Park fashion, with Stan learning to cope with his cynicism by drinking alcohol, which makes everything seem fun again. It's a dark, funny, and surprisingly honest take on how adults manage existential dread. And it's the kind of episode that could only come from creators who had been doing this long enough to genuinely question why they were still doing it. That willingness to be vulnerable, to expose their own doubts and fears through the medium of a crude animated comedy, is what separates Parker and Stone from their imitators. Anyone can be offensive. Anyone can shock people and generate controversy. But very few people can do all of that while also occasionally letting you see the real human beings behind the jokes. The South Park that makes you laugh at a Michael Jackson parody is the same South Park that makes you cry during Landslide. And that range, that ability to go from the lowest humor to the highest emotional truth in the span of a single episode, is what makes the show a genuine work of art, regardless of how many people it offends along the way. There's a moment in the 6 Days to Air documentary where Parker is sitting alone in the writer's room at 3 a.m, exhausted, staring at a screen, trying to figure out an ending for the episode they're producing. Everyone else has gone home or fallen asleep, and Parker's just sitting there, alone with the work, grinding through the doubt and the fatigue because the deadline doesn't care about how he feels. That image, to me, captures something essential about the South Park story. Behind all the controversy, behind all the headlines and the death threats and the $900 million deals, there's just a guy in a room trying to be funny, terrified that he won't be, and doing it anyway. So here we are. We've been together for a while now, and we've covered a lot. Let me see if I can pull all of these threads together into something that makes sense. South Park has been on the air since August of 1997. That's nearly 3 decades. In that time, it has produced over 300 episodes, a feature film, multiple streaming specials, 2 major video games, and enough controversy to fill a library. It has been attacked by the Church of Scientology, the Catholic League, the Chinese Communist Party, radical Islamic extremists, the Parents Television Council, and more individual celebrities than anyone has bothered to count. It has been banned, censored, boycotted, investigated, and threatened with death. And it's still going. If you step back and look at the full arc of the show's history, what you see is something like a decades-long experiment in the limits of free expression. Not a theoretical experiment, not a philosophical thought exercise, but a real, lived, messy, sometimes dangerous experiment conducted in prime time on basic cable by 2 guys from Colorado who started out with construction paper and a dream of making people laugh. The experiment has produced some definitive answers. We know now that you can mock Scientology on television and survive, though it might cost you a beloved cast member and earn you an intelligence investigation. We know you can offend the Catholic Church, and the controversy will ultimately benefit you more than it hurts you. We know you can insult an authoritarian government and get banned from a country of over 1 billion people, and it will barely register as a speed bump. We know you can say the N-word 43 times in 22 minutes and still have your show in the air the next week, as long as you're saying it for a reason that people can at least argue about in good faith. But the experiment has also shown us where the limits are. Real limits. Not the fake limits of offended sensibilities and angry press releases, but the hard limits that are backed by actual violence. When the threats escalated from boycotts to death threats, when the comparison was drawn not to public embarrassment but to actual murder, the system broke. Comedy Central blinked. The episodes were censored, then banned, and they remain banned today. That's the line. You can offend anyone's feelings. You can challenge anyone's beliefs. You can mock anyone's God, anyone's politics, anyone's identity. But you can't do it when someone is standing in the shadows with a weapon, because no corporation will risk its employees' lives for a cartoon, and no reasonable person would ask them to. That's a sobering conclusion, and it's one that I think Parker and Stone have internalized even if they've never said it in exactly those terms. They've continued to push boundaries in every other direction. They still go after celebrities. They still mock religions. They still say things that most other shows wouldn't dare say. But they've never gone back to the Muhammad well. They've never tried again. And their silence on that specific subject speaks volumes about the difference between institutional opposition, which South Park can handle, and existential threats, which it can't. But let's not end on a heavy note, because that's not really what South Park is about. Despite everything we've discussed tonight, the death threats and the bans and the investigations and the international incidents, at its core, South Park is still a comedy. It's still a show about 4 boys in a small town in Colorado who get into ridiculous situations and somehow muddle through. The genius of the show has always been the contrast between the ordinariness of the setting and the insanity of what happens in it. Alien invasions, celebrity cults, government conspiracies, interdimensional monsters, all of it unfolding in a quiet mountain town where the biggest pre-existing concerns were snow, homework, and whether there was anything good to watch on television. And that ordinariness is what grounds the show and makes the satire work. When South Park tackles a big issue, whether it's Scientology or climate change or race relations, it always filters it through the perspective of kids who don't fully understand what's happening, but can usually see through the hypocrisy of the adults around them. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny aren't political commentators. They're not philosophers. They're 10-year-old boys who just want to hang out with their friends and avoid getting grounded. And when the adult world intrudes on their lives with its nonsense and its drama and its self-importance, they respond with the kind of blunt, honest confusion that only children can muster. That perspective is why South Park's satire hits differently from other political comedy. Shows like The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight attack from a position of knowledge and authority. The host has done the research, marshaled the facts, and is ready to prosecute the case. South Park attacks from a position of innocence and bewilderment. The boys don't know why adults are fighting about this stuff, and they're not sure they want to know. They just know that the adults seem crazy, and they're usually right. I think about the show's impact on comedy and culture more broadly, and it's hard to overstate. Before South Park, the idea that an animated show could tackle real-world political and social issues in real time was basically unheard of. The Simpsons did social commentary, but it worked on a months-long production cycle, and its satire was more gentle and more general. South Park proved that animation could be immediate, could be pointed, could be dangerous. It opened a door that other shows have walked through since, from Family Guy to BoJack Horseman to Big Mouth. Though none of them have matched South Park's combination of speed, sharpness, and sheer audacity. The show also fundamentally changed the economics of cable television. Before South Park, cable networks were minor players in the entertainment landscape. After South Park, Comedy Central became a destination. The show proved that a single program could transform an entire network, and that lesson was learned by executives across the industry. It's not an exaggeration to say that the modern landscape of cable and streaming comedy owes a significant debt to what happened when 2 college kids sold a crude animated pilot to a network nobody watched. And then there's the influence on political discourse. This is a more complicated legacy and one that people will debate for a long time. South Park popularized a particular strain of political nihilism that can be summed up as both sides are equally ridiculous. The show has consistently maintained that caring too much about anything, whether it's politics, religion, social justice, or the environment, is inherently foolish, and that the correct posture is detached amusement. That philosophy has been incredibly influential, particularly among younger viewers who grew up with the show and absorbed its worldview. Some people see this as a positive contribution. In a political culture that's increasingly polarized and tribal, the argument goes, South Park's refusal to align with any team is a valuable corrective. It keeps people skeptical of authority, suspicious of ideologues, and resistant to groupthink. The world needs jesters who mock everyone. The argument continues because jesters keep power honest. Others see it differently. They argue that South Park's both sides nihilism has contributed to a culture of cynicism and disengagement, particularly among young people. If everything is equally ridiculous, the argument goes, then nothing matters. And if nothing matters, then there's no reason to participate in civic life or fight for anything. The show's influence from this perspective has been corrosive. It's easier to laugh at everyone than to take a stand, and South Park has given an entire generation permission to choose laughter over engagement. I don't think either of those positions is entirely right or entirely wrong. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. South Park has done genuine good by puncturing pomposity, exposing hypocrisy, and refusing to let anyone claim moral superiority unchallenged. It has also done some harm by encouraging the belief that all positions are equally absurd and that caring about things is for suckers. The man-bear-pig correction, where Parker and Stone admitted they'd been wrong about climate change, suggests that even they have come to recognize the limits of their own philosophy. Sometimes one side is right and the other side is wrong, and pretending otherwise isn't enlightened. It's just lazy. But you know what? That complexity, that ambiguity, that inability to reduce South Park to a simple good or bad verdict, that's actually what makes the show interesting. If it were just good, it would be boring. If it were just harmful, it would have been canceled long ago. The fact that it's both, that it exists in a permanent state of creative tension between insight and offense, between brilliance and crudeness, between courage and recklessness, that's what keeps people watching and arguing about it after almost 30 years. And I think that's the appropriate note to begin wrapping up on, because this is a conversation that doesn't really have a conclusion. South Park is still going. New episodes are still being produced. New controversies are still being generated. The story isn't over, and it won't be over until Parker and Stone decide they're done, which, given the $900 million deal they signed, probably won't be for a while yet. Let me leave you with a few thoughts to carry with you as you drift off tonight. First, the banned episodes. As of right now, 5 episodes of South Park remain officially banned from all streaming and broadcast platforms. Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Part 1, Cartoon Wars Part 2, 200, and 201. If you want to see them, you'll have to find them on your own. They're out there. The internet is a big place, but officially they don't exist. Whether that state of affairs will ever change is anyone's guess. My personal feeling is that it probably won't change anytime soon because the dynamics that led to the ban in the first place haven't fundamentally shifted. The threats may be less immediate than they were in 2010, but the corporate risk calculus hasn't changed. No streaming platform wants to be the one that makes that call. Second, Parker and Stone. Whatever you think of their show, their politics, or their sense of humor, it's hard to deny that they have lived one of the most remarkable creative lives in the history of American entertainment. They went from making construction paper shorts in a college dorm to being worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they did it entirely on their own terms. They never compromised. They never sold out. They never stopped being the weird, irreverent, anti-authoritarian kids they were when they started. In an industry that chews people up and spits them out, that rewards conformity and punishes risk, Parker and Stone have managed to stay true to themselves for 3 decades. Whether you love the show or hate it, that's impressive. Third, the lessons. If there's a single takeaway from the entire South Park saga, from the spirit of Christmas shorts to the China ban and beyond, it's that censorship rarely works the way the censors intend. Every attempt to silence South Park has made it louder. Every boycott has increased its audience. Every ban has increased its cultural significance. The Streisand effect isn't just a fun internet concept. It's a fundamental truth about human nature. The more you tell people they can't see something, the more desperate they become to see it. The more you try to suppress an idea, the more powerful the idea becomes. That doesn't mean all speech is good, or that all offensive content is valuable, or that Parker and Stone have always been right in what they've chosen to say and how they've chosen to say it. They haven't. They've admitted as much themselves. But the principle underlying their entire body of work, the idea that the answer to speech you disagree with is more speech, not less, that principle is as important today as it was when South Park first aired nearly 3 decades ago. Maybe more so. The world has changed a lot since 1997. The internet has transformed how we communicate, how we argue, and how we try to silence each other. Social media has given everyone a megaphone and a mute button. The tools of censorship are more powerful and more widely distributed than they've ever been. And in that environment, the existence of a show like South Park, loud, crude, fearless, occasionally wrong, but always honest, feels more valuable than ever. Because here's the thing, South Park doesn't just make us laugh. It makes us argue. It makes us think. It makes us uncomfortable. It forces us to confront the gap between what we say we believe and how we actually behave. It holds up a mirror, and the mirror isn't flattering, and we can't look away because the show is too funny and too smart and too provocative to ignore. That's an extraordinary achievement for any piece of art, let alone a cartoon about 4 foul-mouthed kids in a small town in Colorado. I think that's going to be a pretty good place for us to leave things tonight. We've been through a lot together. We've covered the origins, the early controversies, the Scientology war, the Catholic boycott, the Muhammad death threats, the celebrity feuds, the racial episodes, the China ban, the evolution of the show over 3 decades, and the reasons why it refuses to die. That's a lot of South Park history, and I hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as I've enjoyed telling it. If this is your first time here, welcome. There is plenty more content like this on the channel, and I'd love to have you back. If you're a returning viewer, thank you for coming back. I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. If you want to support what I do here, the best way is to subscribe, leave a like, or share this video with someone you think would enjoy it. All of those things help more than you'd think, and I notice every one of them. But for now, I think that's enough. It's late, and you've been listening for a while, and you deserve some rest. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the images from tonight's stories fade away. Think about construction paper in Colorado mountains and 2 kids with a $1,200 check and a dream of making something that mattered. They did it. Against every odd, every objection, every threat, and every attempt to shut them down, they did it. And they're still doing it. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.